Very much. And so to kick things off, we'll ask clerk to call the roll, please.
I'm just going to call the roll of the planning commissioners. Should I call everybody?
You just need to call the planning commission. I think it's fine.
Commissioner Rodriguez.
Here.
Commissioner Onstadt.
Here.
Commissioner Kessley.
Here.
Commissioner White.
Here.
Commissioner Dugas.
Here.
All right. And I'd like to defer to my planning commissioner colleague chair in terms of if there's anything you want to say as we kick this off before we start with the uniqueness.
No, not really. We pretty well went through it, I think, the last time we were here. I haven't gotten any other response from the fellow commissioners at the last meeting.
Okay.
We
good.
had on Thursday,
So we'll hear staff's presentation. We'll then have questions of staff. Then we'll open it up to the public hearing. We'll then close the public hearing. We'll give staff a chance to respond to anything they heard in public hearing. We'll have any final questions for staff, and then we'll enter into our deliberations. All right. And ultimately, there will be a vote of the Planning Commission separate from a vote of the Board of Supervisors. Is that how everybody thinks it's going to happen? All right. All right. Great.
And
okay.
I don't think our screens are working in terms of being able to see the reports and things.
Yeah, we'll want to be able to see it. We'll want to be able to see the PowerPoints. Turn it on and off. I turn the screen on and off, and it works just fine.
You can do guest logins, and you can still see the materials.
Okay. All right. Hopefully, we'll be.
They all got logged out.
It all depends, right? All right. And for the benefit of the public that's out there that's going to testify, it'll be 3 minutes in terms of your comments. And all right, we'll turn it over to staff.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Bennett and members of the board and your Planning Commission. Thank you for having us this afternoon. My name is Susan Curtis. I'm the manager of the General Plan Update Project. We're here for our joint study session to present to you the first in a two-part series of the alternatives report. This series we're going to present today is chapters 1 through 6, and it's based on direction we received from your board and your commission at the April 17th joint work session. I would like to introduce the General Plan Update team, which includes Clay Downing, our planner, Shelley Sussman, who's our senior planner, of course, Kim Perlhart, who's our director. We also have our lead consultant team here from Mintier Harnish. We have Mr. Jim Harnish, and we have our the principal and project manager, Rick Rust, with us this afternoon as well. We're going to be just to profile on the report. We've worked long and hard, a lot of hours to put together a lot of information. We know some of it is complex. We've tried to distill it down and simplify it. But we do have the expert in the room of Mr. Rust, who put together a really complex modeling program for the holding capacity and the development potential he's going to talk about today. And so we're really excited to be able to have to share the information and have a good discussion and get us to the next piece of this project, where we can come back to you in the fall and present the second part of this alternatives report. So on that note, I'd like to have the presentation teed up so we can hand the presentation over to Mr. Rust to go through the various chapters of the report that you have as your exhibits. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Bennett, the rest of the board, and the planning commissioners. Thank you for having us again and taking time this afternoon for this presentation. We'd like to walk you through the first half, if you will, of the alternatives report. Last time we were here, we were talking about the alternatives concept report, which kind of set up the framework for what we'll be talking about over these next 2 meetings we have on the general plan. What we're doing at this point really is to make sure that we have, for the Planning Commission and the board members, that we have your ideas, your thoughts, your inputs on the direction the plan is going. Nothing that we're going to talk about today. I think at times you hear the word approval in your package and the board letter, et cetera. And we're looking for you to approve a course of action, a direction for us to go. But nothing that we say here today is set in stone. You're not making a final adoption of anything that we do or a final approval of that. But this is a time for us to check in, tell you the direction we're going, what we've investigated and thought about, and what findings that we have come to date. And this will help us as we further move towards setting up the project. So we got the word approval right on the front there, but again, as we said, we're going through and looking at a set of directions, guidance as what we should do in the next steps. But they break down into several pieces which fall along with several of the chapters. Looking at land use designation modifications, which are covered in Chapter 3. Looking at a selection of development constraints and how those work towards what we're looking at for development potential. The use of the development potential methodology and what that really means and what are we trying to do. We'll give you a highlight that development potential is not a milestone. It's not something that we're shooting to reach. We're just using this to inform and look that we have the appropriate capacities on hand. And the short answer is you do. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes as we get down to that part. And then we also provided a set of...
There will be significant conversation about that, so this will alert you to that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And as we go through this, I'm hoping to provide some more clarification over what was presented in the report to make sure that it's fully understood what it is we're proposing and getting your recommendation on which way we should go. The second piece is just getting your direction to continue on to the next step. The next step deals with looking at the policy alternatives, where we will come back and talk about some of the tough questions and what are some of the possible policy choices that can be made to answer those questions. In other words, what might you do to solve some of the issues that have been identified from the input received? We'll also talk about land use alternatives and then an evaluation system, which at your last meeting, the board directed that be based upon the guiding principles.
Could you go back one slide, please?
Yes, sir.
I just want to check one. Got it. Okay.
We'll note that as part of your package, you've seen a couple sets of public comments that have come in as part of the review process. We have reviewed all of the comments that have been submitted to date. The comments fall into 3 major categories. There were several that were dealing with the background report. And the background report, which has already been presented last year to the Board and Planning Commission, will be updated as we go towards the environmental impact report later in the process. And these comments will be kept on hand to inform those updates. We also had some letters that provided some looks to the future, that is, policy recommendations or actions that should be taken to address issues or concerns that the public individuals had. And then we received one letter in particular from Mr. Smith that was talking about a number of comments on the alternatives report specifically. I can give you overall that we find those comments to be good comments to make and the clarifications to the document, in a few cases some modifications to some tables to make sure they read clearer. And so we would intend to update the document with those. And for the more significant ones, I intend to bring those to your attention as we walk through the presentation.
But in general, you were in agreement with
Yes,
those
sir.
modifications that you made. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So we presented this chart before. It's just our flow chart of where we've been and where we're going. Starting in late 2015 with the initiation of the project, there's 7 phases overall to the general plan update, and we're currently in phase number 4, where we're looking at the alternatives process and what's going forward. And this alternatives process will continue on through the remainder of this year as we go to the next steps. And your meeting right now tentatively set for mid-October. This alternatives report is one of a number of reports. Starting in the upper left corner, you have the Issues and Opportunities report that was originally developed based on public input, interviews that were conducted, input from our focus groups and TAC members. and staff and looking at what are the overall issues and areas that we might need to address. This also helped inform an opinion poll that was conducted, again also to help refine and identify areas to look at in the document. The background report in the upper right-hand corner was basically finished in a draft last year, or actually in January was the final publication of that. Again, that will be updated as we go towards the environmental impact reporting. That's towards the last part of this flow chart. The visions and guiding principles have been before the board and the Planning Commission at a variety of workshops as well as some joint meetings. And what's presented today is what was approved at the last meeting by the board. Alternatives concept report we went over in April, and today we're starting off with the alternatives report. The overall purpose of all this is to develop a set of alternatives that we can use to help us frame and develop a preferred alternative and to develop the actual general plan update itself. When we're looking at the alternatives, and especially as we get to the next stage where we're looking at policy alternatives, we're going to be asking some tough questions, some things that are on the forefronts of your mind about what the county might do to address topics as they come up in the future. And so some of these are going to be new items. Some of these will be new things required by the state of California. Some of these will be items that got brought up during the issues and opportunities assessment at the beginning of the project. But there will be the broad trend setters, if you will, the ones that will tell us the ideas that will really guide the framework for the document. It's not the entire policy set, but policies that we think reflect different choices and different directions you might take on key issues that will come up. And that will be something that will be addressed in the October timeframe. So today, we want to highlight what's in the alternatives report relative to chapters 1 through 6. So for today, looking at the first 6 chapters, we're going to walk through each of these individually, so I won't read the list right now. And as we mentioned, on October 16th, we're scheduled to come back and look at the last half of the alternatives report, as well if there's any questions or actions from the planning commissioners or board today that you'd like us to take back and provide further information. We'd be glad to bring that back at that October date as well and provide information sooner as appropriate and per your direction. Chapter 1, on your first list of actions, there is no action specific on this. This is just setting up the overall framework for the alternatives report. Primarily, what is its purpose, and also what is the construct, and what do the different chapters represent. Probably not too much to comment on here, but I will break after each chapter or during it to see if there's any points of discussion you wish on the beginning of the document, or if I should continue. Okay. Chapter 2 is also not on your action list, but it's been a topic that has come up a number of times. If you look at the overall history, at our last meeting we had on April 17th, a joint meeting with the Planning Commission and the board, we looked at a revised version of the vision and guiding principles. And at that time, there were a number of comments made on the document. And this was, again, brought forward to the board itself on May 8th, at which some additional changes were made. And those should all be reflected in the document and part of Chapter 2 that you have in front of you. We can take a pause here, but I assume we're good to go on those. There was a comment from Mr. Smith that talked about perhaps they could be reordered, and we'd like to reserve that as a possibility, not changing the content of the principles themselves, but the comment was it might make more sense to put them in the same order as the elements, and that order will be up in your agenda here shortly. So that might be a possibility, but otherwise they would remain unchanged in their content. Okay. 2 down, 4 to go. Unfortunately, they get harder from here. I wish I had several more chapters 1 and 2, but we're on to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 talks about the general plan's organization. And there's 2 key components that we talk about in this chapter, and that is the actual document structure, if you will, the chapters that make up the document. And then we're also going to talk about the land use designations. I'm sure you mentioned that may be a point that we want to clarify, and I'm going to give you a few clarifications, I think, on some key pieces as we go through that. The current county general plan is ordered on more of a thematic structure. That is, a number of the elements that are required by the state were aggregated together. And this structure was used often as a way to present information because quite a few of the topics inside of a general plan are related to each other. In fact, you can often argue that one topic could be one element or another and not quite sure where it might place. But we find that as the state has added additional requirements, there are new topics and chapters that are required, that going back to a more traditional element structure can be a better way to go forward as far as organization, because we find that it would be easier to find the information and easier to keep it updated long term. As far as what are the new components, and this is just a partial list, but since the county's plan was last updated, the state's been busy and has added a number of responsibilities for the county to include in the general plan. These include items such as looking at environmental justice, which is part of Senate Bill 1000, talking about identification of disadvantaged communities and identification of policies and issues that can help address items related to health risks and other disadvantages for those locations within the county. Dealing with the issue of climate change and climate adaptation, which includes a range of topics and vulnerabilities, which can range from extreme heat, precipitation, drought, wildfire, sea level rise, flooding, and other related impacts. So the document as a whole will need to address all the items the state has laid out for climate change, as well as putting the climate action plan into the overall general plan as far as a guidance document for the overall plan. Community health, and we use community in the broad sense, but it's a particular importance to the state and a number of looks at what should be done to help provide for people's activities, getting people out in the world. This is not only just recreation, but it's access to healthy foods, providing better means for other options besides the automobile, for walking and biking, providing access to farmers markets, better farm to fork kind of implementations, and especially in a county like Ventura with the extensive agricultural productivity, having access to that kind of fresh food and easy access to it is an important component. Flood risk requirements have changed as part of Assembly Bill 162. Complete streets is another big item. That's Assembly Bill 1358. The whole item with complete streets is looking beyond just what does the roadway do for me. And that is, what are all the different modes of transportation that need to be addressed, whether it be rail, heavy rail, lighter rail, highways, roadways, bicycle, pedestrian paths, and walkways, and marinas and boat traffic, as well as aircraft traffic. But beyond just how we move around, it's who is moving around and what are the limitations on them accessing the places they need to go in the county. So how does this address those that might have disadvantages for moving around the county, those that might be elderly or other restrictions on their movement? So Complete Streets looks at more than just the physical structure, but also the infrastructure needed to assist the people. A big new change is related to vehicle miles traveled thresholds. Now this requirement, and you're required to have this updated by 2020, is to create a threshold. This requires you to create a new threshold or set of thresholds that will be used in your CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, findings in the future. So if you do an environmental impact report or even a mitigated negative declaration, you're going to be using VMT as a method for defining whether you have traffic impacts. Now, I know a common question we often get is what happens to our level of service? We loved it and we like it and still want it around. For most of our clients now, we're talking to them about having both sets of criteria. You will have the VMT to address issues for CEQA, but you also need to have level of service to address issues related to physical infrastructure, and especially for the creation of a nexus for where you're trying to get development costs reimbursed to fix the signal on the corner of that new shopping center. So these are not replacing one another, but it's a different way to look at the overall CEQA impacts.
So you're suggesting we will end up with both?
I imagine this will be one of those topics that will be in that policy discussion in October, but for most of our clients now, we are looking at including both as part of this process.
Great. Okay. And I just want to suggest, you said, do we have any discussion with each one of these chapters? I think for us to have discussion, we ought to do that after the public testimony, but during each one of these, when you pause, that's when we should ask the questions that we might have on that particular topic as
Absolutely.
we go forward. Okay.
Yes, I'd be glad to clarify or
Great.
go further. If you get me started talking about the development model, I may talk all sorts of things, but.
Okay, so then maybe I can ask this question. For the established vehicle miles, is that a want or the actual data? There are goals and objectives, or there's actual data that happens now? What are the numbers that they're going to be using for that?
You're required to put in place thresholds. Those thresholds will be set locally, so there'll be something that we'll set as part of the policies in the general plan itself.
Okay. And then going back then, on community health, shouldn't that be saying healthy communities?
It's also referred to that way. I'm not exactly sure what the order we got our words here versus others, but that's often used as well, yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're in alignment on the state and federal grants that are coming through, that it reflects in our plan as well.
Yes, it's got the exact same intent.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, young man, can you go back to the environmental justice? What was the new requirements for that environmental justice?
Environmental justice was set in Senate Bill 1000. It requires us to both identify disadvantaged communities as well as to develop policy to address health risks relative to those disadvantaged communities. So in a broad sense, this is going towards the idea of why is the landfill always next to certain parts of town. To be able to take that into consideration, not that you necessarily couldn't put the landfill where you need to put it, but that you need to consider this whole range of environmental justice issues.
Or a power plant or
where you might have groundwater contamination, where you might have limited access to infrastructure that might degrade your quality of life, access to transit, et cetera. Those can all be parts of the environmental justice fabric.
Okay, so that's a new requirement.
That's a new state requirement, and that will be covered in
SB 1000.
SB 1000, yes.
Okay, thank you.
There's some enhanced requirements now for cultural resource identification and recording, and also for Native American consultations as part of the planning process. So as we go forward with the documents, this will be conducted as far as any local tribal interests. Infrastructure is also tied, this is Senate Bill 244, is also tied to looking at infrastructure, and again, it ties into disadvantaged communities, and so it's another part of the environmental justice piece. When we talk about infrastructure here, we're talking about the full spectrum of infrastructure, from the standard things such as wastewater and water pipes, all the way to broadband communications to provide internet access to different locations. Yes, sir.
Is that a duck, for example, disadvantaged community? Would that
Yes.
be? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
The last item on here, and again, there's a brand new set of state guidelines that came out in 2017. Everything that's required in those will be addressed as far as your update. We wanted to highlight some of the big items that we know are here. Also wanted to note that included on this list is military compatibility and consultation. There are a number of Senate bills, 1468 and 926, that deal with that. You do have the advantage in that you finished, were part of the Naval Base Ventura County Joint Land Use Study a couple years ago. And so the items that are included in that document as far as implementation and protections for military compatibility will be proposed as part of this general plan update, subject to your approval, of course.
One item, is any new guidelines coming in on ports? Is that something that we need to be looking at? We have our Port of
There's issues-
Wainimi. I just want to make sure that if there's any new rules and regulations that were covered.
Relevant ports. Not that I recall offhand, but I.
That can be an answer later. I just thought I
Yeah,
would make
or-
sure we don't forget about that.
Okay, we've got contacts with the commercial port as well as the naval base, Ventura County. We'll check with them on both sides if we have any federal or state items
Thank
that
you.
we should be addressing.
Okay. One more thing on the infrastructure. Are parks included in that for community parks?
Not specifically for infrastructure, but that would be covered under the healthy communities.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it ties in with environmental justice relative to walking distances and actual,
the
in
park
some
and-
places,
okay.
the lack of parks in certain areas can be an issue that needs to be addressed under environmental justice.
Okay, well, thank you.
So the structure that we're looking at today is up on the board and part of the alternatives report. As I mentioned, we're going to a more standard element structure. Now, over time, there are 9 elements that are required by the state. To the list of 7 that have been there forever, environmental justice and air quality have also been added as new element requirements. Now, when the state states that you need to have an element, that doesn't mean that you physically have to have a separate standalone chapter on just that topic. They can be combined, they can be put in with other topic areas and arranged. For instance, on here, number 6, conservation and open space are 2 separate elements under what the state requires, but they're very typically combined because they have quite a bit of overlap between each other and they just work very well together. Hazards and safety tends to address both the safety element requirements as well as noise. It also will probably pick up some of the air quality components in there as well. And then as a structure, there's also 3 what they would call an optional element, things that aren't called for by the state but have significant relevance to the county as far as moving forward. And what's being suggested is a separate water, agriculture, and economic development elements be added to this.
Okay.
So they're not a mandate, although pieces of all of these are covered in part of the guidelines under other elements, but because of their significance to the county, they were seen as being a good subject to have in a separate standalone element.
And we heard that from our stakeholder groups too, correct?
Correct.
Thank
yes. Okay, so now for the hard part. Land use designations. What we're going to talk about with land use designations, and this is actually what you call the different areas of the community, and it guides what might happen there. We have 2 options. One of them is based on your current general plans options and the designations that you're familiar with, but we'll show on an upcoming slide. So we want to look at, for both of these, look at the addition of information on densities and intensities and information on land uses as far as what's allowed and where it might be allowed. Those are 2 items that the state wants to see in your land use designations, and right now they're really not covered in your current land use designations to the extent they probably would be good to have. So what we're going to look at in these 2 options is how might we enhance some of that while still keeping the same flavor for what we're trying to achieve in the overall land use designations. So option 1 is to maintain the 6 broadly based land use definitions used in the current general plan. But to this, to partially address the items we were talking about, would be to add in some density and intensity information into those designations. We'll get to a table in just a moment on that. The second option, and this is one I want to make sure I clarify because I think this may cause some confusions in it. Both options maintain the agriculture, open space, and rural designations the way they are. Both options 1 and 2 maintain that connection and what SOAR is looking at as far as the protections provided. So that is kind of off the table perhaps in that way because we think we have it pretty much the same as it has been. The other question is about the guidelines for orderly development, and there are connections through that as well as in the general plan itself that talk about the use of existing communities and urban as far as designations. What we're proposing, and we have option 2 on the right side, option 1 on the left. Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Dukas.
I'm sorry, if you could go back a minute. Did you say that this was a state mandate that we have this second option, or is this something that?
The general plan
Something else.
guidelines state that land use designations should talk about the types of uses that are appropriate on a property and also talk about the density and intensity appropriate for that. At the current time, in your current general plan, there are not really true density intensity ramifications associated with the different designations. There are minimum lot sizes for some of them, but not all of them. Frankly, for the designations, they don't really say what you can do inside of them.
Are they legally sufficient, or will they be legally sufficient?
No, I don't want to claim to be illegal. I don't believe they meet the intent of the guidelines, no. but that's not a legal opinion, that's just my own.
Commissioner Long.
I had a question on some of the cross-referencing from the first one to the second sample. For example, you have industrial. On existing community, on the first on the left, it says 50% maximum building at 6,000 square feet is the minimum. On your right, you have industrial is 50% building lot, and you have a 20,000 square foot minimum. Why the differential? I'm not sure if this is simplifying or we're changing things, and I just would like to understand that.
It's a good question in a broad sense, because what we're really looking for today, and we want to make sure everybody's clear on this, is we're looking for some direction on option 1 or option 2. The actual specifics and numbers in there are not what we're looking for your guidance on today specifically, because if we picked option 2, what option 2 requires is that we go into all the unincorporated communities and areas and actually give the parcels a color. If that parcel should be residential, to color it for residential. As we get to that kind of level, we need to look at what's being portrayed here for minimum lot sizes, what's being portrayed for densities, and these are going to have to probably change a little bit.
Okay, because maybe I had a clarification that I needed, but I thought we were taking the modified current land and just expanding it to your different options, but keeping the same numbers. And then once we keep those same numbers, we're mapping it, color mapping it, and then understanding what the capacity is currently. I didn't think that we were changing it before we do the mapping. So I wasn't prepared to come here today and say I want 6,000 versus 20. I thought we were sticking with the numbers we had and then understanding the needs assessment based on what we had. And maybe other
Actually,
commissioners or supervisors had different ideas, but.
Well, if I could clarify, the stuff that's in the red box you don't have right now. So when it says
Okay,
6,000,
so
you
it's
don't
all new.
currently require that. And as I was saying, what we would have to do for any of these is go into the individual communities and locations and work out a system that exactly matches them. We haven't done that part yet because we're waiting for some direction from the board and the commission relative to your desires for which way should go, because it would take a notable amount of effort to do either one of these, and we want to make sure that we get the one you want.
So then if the information on the left is new, and I apologize, you're right, it says new, and I just didn't see it for this minute. Why didn't we transfer it over to the right and still have the same new? I guess that's why I'm asking.
Well, under the,
Does an option 2 give you more specifics?
But
well,
it-
she's asking specifically about why does it say 6 on
Yeah.
one and why does it say 20 on the other.
Yeah,
They're just placeholders at this point. We've looked at some communities and they go all the way down to 6, and some places really to get a decent commercial industrial development, especially industrial, you're looking at 20s. We also will probably have more difference between commercial versus industrial. You can get commercial on a much smaller lot than you can in industrial. And again, we will have to go through and define what's really makes sense. We don't want to create a bunch of nonconformities out in the county areas.
Okay.
So we'll have to make sure we look at that.
But your commercial is at 20,000 square feet also.
yeah.
Correct, sir. It will probably go down from there.
So the slide only for illustration, is that it?
The slide's illustrating two concepts.
Yeah.
One is, on the left side, you have what the county general plan current says, but the county general plan doesn't really do a good job at defining density or intensity. So remember, I said there was two issues we're trying to address. Identifying density and intensity is one, and the second one is identifying what is the actual land uses that are allowed on a property and where might those be. Now, number one only addresses one of those. We've added, the idea is to add density and intensity to that. And those numbers can modify. Where we have a minimum lot size right now, we might have different lot sizes for industrial commercial. We have to break that out from each other. But what you're getting from this is you're keeping the same designations, but you're modifying them to add in an idea of density and intensity.
So you are adding additional designations, correct?
On that one, no.
Option 2 doesn't
Option-
add additional?
Option two is adding.
Additional
yes.
designations. I'm sorry, you weren't there yet. And then you did note that you agreed with Mr. Smith's comments, which on the chart to the left would then remove commercial and industrial from rural designations, correct?
That's actually
Yeah, it
a
is.
point of discussion that I would like to
Oh, I
ask.
thought you had kind of indicated you agreed with Mr. Smith's points, but that one's a point of discussion.
The only point of discussion is right now in your current general plan, it talks about land uses resident, such as residential. So your current designation doesn't, such as isn't a legally definable term unless you're really trying to just say that one component. The other thing is it allows agricultural and horticultural support facilities. You also have in the rural areas a range of commercial, industrial, public, quasi-public structures, such as substations, cell phone towers, et cetera. There's nowhere in the current general plan that provides for that actually to happen, although it's an infrastructure piece that is needed in the area. So what we're looking for here is under that option 1 for rural, we would not change the discussion about what's allowed. I think it needs to be a little sharper and not use terms such as, but the intent is not to suddenly allow neighborhood commercial into the rural designation. The idea is that you do have some structures that could fall into a commercial industrial that are allowed currently, but they don't really have any guidance for how big they might be on a property. So we're just taking your existing one and providing some guidance to that. The general plan will still say the range of uses is limited to what I believe you were picturing as being the rural designation, low-intensity residential, ag support facilities,
And we did, many years ago, have a very robust discussion that included all the cities. And the results of that was we did not want to go to lower than 1 unit per 2 acres on rural designated lands, which shows at the top on the right. And as I see, the recommendation is to include additional rural designations that would actually allow for more density than 1 unit per 2 acres. The inclusion, for example, of a new designation called rural residential. So just bringing that up because we have a pretty strong line in the sand where we didn't want to take rural lands and make them more urban.
And on both of them, we're consistent with what you're describing. If you, I don't know if this points, no. If you look at the residential in option 1, it says 0.2 to 0.5.
Excuse me a minute. We really need you to have a pointer with all of us here. Yeah. Can you get the pointer to work? There you go. Good. All right.
There is one.
Thank you.
Okay. 0.5 VUs per acre is 1 unit per 2 acres. The minimum lot size is 2 acres. This is what your general plan currently requires. We have no change. On this side here, anything that's in rural in your current general plan would stay rural in the new designation. It again has 1 unit per 2 acres as defined by the minimum lot size.
What's the next line then? Rural residential.
There's a group of designations, and I mentioned earlier, because in order to stay consistent with the guidelines for orderly development, we still need the terms existing community and urban. We plan to put policy in the document, or we would recommend, let me say it that way, because I don't plan anything yet. We would recommend for your consideration that we would include a policy that would state that it would create a boundary called a existing community designation boundary, and we'd have an urban boundary. The areas that have that color on your map today would be an outline. So that would match you up to your guidelines for orderly development, because there would be a designation in the general plan that has a geographic definition to it, the exact same as it is in your current plan, unless you would like otherwise. That rural only goes where there's rural now. These other designations below here, we go into what we're calling that existing communities and urban boundaries. Inside of those, right now your general plan states that you can be commercial, industrial, residential, whatever size, shape. You don't have much guidance.
Got it.
What we would like to recommend is consideration of keeping your same boundaries, keeping your same rural, open space, agriculture designations in place. Those are the same on both ones. We're not changing those at all. But the other ones like rural residential, again, that's a name, meaning it's just low intensity, but the rural part, perhaps, sir, that would be good to take that word off of there so it doesn't confuse.
It sure would, because I've had a lot of people, it's been an issue. I mean, it looks like you're taking the rural, and you're taking some part of the rural is going to become denser than what we currently are allowing in rural areas. And if that instead would say,
If it said very, very low residential, for example, you've got low, you could have very low, but you're only talking about lands that are already in the existing community and parsing those up into more designations.
And actually putting a color on them, yes.
and not increasing their densities.
They don't really have a density right now.
Well,
in existing communities, it doesn't really say.
Right. Not increasing densities anywhere. For example, the way the SOAR restrictions are in place, we can't increase densities. We can't go into the rural and suddenly say, okay, now we're going to allow 3 units per acre in rural, right? That would be a violation.
The rural, the open space, the agriculture will remain as they are currently in your general plan, therefore staying in the intent of SOAR. No intention to intensify.
No, there will be no intensification with this new designation.
Those designations, correct.
How does it work then also with the proposed parks and recreation? As you have lands that are designated open space and protected by SOAR, and now you want another designation that would take some parks and recreation. I'm not sure what that is, but wouldn't that be lands in the open space designation?
And we understood the board had interest in looking at a parks designation. We would picture this being something that ties in with the healthy communities concept, and it would be public lands set aside for active recreational uses inside of an existing community or urban area or area plan area.
I think it might have gotten lost in translation. What the board approved was an overlay zone on open space. So it would still have the protections of SOAR. It would still be open space designation, but it would be, and what was approved by the board as recommended by the Oak Park MAC and all was a public lands designation, so state parks, lands that are owned by the public in the open space zone would be so designated so they couldn't be, put in landfills and things like that our county does allow in open space.
Okay.
So we wanted to separate those out, but sounds like we might have a problem if you do a new designation that isn't open space that would have parks and recreation, because it may not have the SOAR protections.
And that's good. Thank you for the clarification. I think in our minds, we had in mind this was more in the existing community areas. It would be a designation, just as we have low-density residential, you might also have parks and recreation. So it would be an actual place with a playground and a picnic shelter and...
Okay, but then that's a designation in an existing community. It isn't the request that the board approved to look at an overlay zone for public lands in the open space designation. Those would be two separate things then, I guess. As
you're describing, yes, two separate things. And
okay.
If you would like to have the overlay, that can certainly be added as well for the different purposes you described.
I think we did approve that.
I just want to ask the question, both of you and then of Kim and our staff managing this. This is a new request, not a new request, it's a request of Supervisor Parks that maybe wasn't completed completely. Does that cause any problems for you guys going forward if in fact you went this way plus you added the other designation? Are you clear on the designation request that she's making? I'm not sure you're clear by the look on your face at least, right? Which is fine. I'd rather be clear. It's better to say we're not clear and get it straight.
So it will take me a while to go back and look through the minutes. I believe both of them are achievable, and so while you continue your discussion, we're going to go back and look through the assignments just to make sure.
Okay, Supervisor Parks, they'll do it. Great, thank you.
Okay, another question. Example, I have a packing house in a rural area, so that zoning is not changing? So it's still going to be considered rural? Or before it was commercial, industrial, residential? Do they have to change anything?
Well, what we were proposing, and again, that's kind of what this commercial industrial, and perhaps there's a better word for it for the rural category. Perhaps it's agricultural support facilities and public, quasi-public facilities or institutional. There's some things that are allowed in the rural designation, We would like to give them an intensity kind of classification, but perhaps that term, commercial and industrial, is not appropriate for the rural category as it would be for the others.
Well, I always like to see what's actually out there and see if it fits within. The other thing, if we're talking about the SOAR, in SOAR, I believe they were talking about a packing house kind of area. Where does that lay out on this? And then also, we've all had discussions on the farm worker housing, and where does that lay out in here? I don't see it. Maybe I'm missing it.
Farm worker housing would be addressed likely as a separate policy that has a modification to other zones and where it might be allowed and what kind of situations it would be allowed in, how it would be developed.
Is that in the future, 7, 8, 9, I think I saw that, I'm not sure. The farm worker housing, is that
I wasn't sure if we're going to change zonings or new, how that relates.
The farm worker housing is typically not a designation, but it would be a discussion about how that's evaluated and treated. Both categories don't have a separate farm worker housing designation. It would be preferable just to have a policy addressing how the county looks at that, and it would also state what designations that might be allowed in and what are the conditions for that approval.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Commissioner Dukas.
Going back to Mr. Smith's document, it says staff is proposing to eliminate the existing community designation, which would result in an inconsistency with the current general guidelines for orderly development.
Correct.
Are you in agreement with that? Is that something that's been?
That was the point I was making earlier. There will be a policy that will define the existing community and the urban as designated places, and it'll have a map.
Where is it? I'm sorry. Where?
It will happen.
It will. That's what I was making a point of that earlier because I wanted to make sure it was clear that we're not getting rid of it. It will be a separate map that will outline where those are located. It will describe what their purpose is. It'll talk about how that description will apply for the guidelines for orderly development definition of those terms, as well as any other existing county policies and regulations that use that term. So we'll try to tie everything together. We'll define the boundaries as they currently stand for both communities, existing communities, and the urban, and make sure that we have the same locations, that it's clearly defined, and it'll meet the requirements of the guidelines for orderly development for definition. Now, inside of those boundaries, like an existing community, these other designations in option 2 would apply.
And only in those existing communities will some of these designations apply. I think in the future it may be helpful to draw another column and say in existing communities or not in existing communities. So we know that you're only referring to a designation in those existing communities, which would help us stay in line with our guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize, the graphic at this point is not as clear for expressing that concern. And I understand, and especially after Mr. Smith's letter, we had make sure that this could have been a little clearer in how it was presented. But what we're shooting for is the process fully respecting what the guidelines for early development and SOAR are both trying to achieve. And the intent in all of this is not to modify that, but to give you better clarity and better definition about what future land uses might be within the county. We think it provides, if you talk about what you look at for in land use planning, it's kind of the traditional, if I'm in a residential structure here, what might be able to be built next to me? In the existing community designation right now, it could be a store, it could be a packing plant, and there should be a little bit more definition we are proposing to make it clearer for the expectations for those properties and what might be allowed within them, and also to better meet what the guidelines are talking about for a adequate land use designation.
I appreciate that. My question for you is to go back to the first category, the one on the left. Are you suggesting that if we didn't go with option 2, we went with option 1, this is an example of what modifications of density and intensity would look like, and we would end up with something like this on the left?
Not the exact numbers, perhaps. We'll look around through it all, but yeah, something like this.
But basically, this would be the level of specificity that would be there, and that's what you would have.
Based on comments from Supervisor Long, I think also might look at commercial having a different minimum size than perhaps industrial. And that would be something we might refine. But in general, it would be this kind of construct.
But it wouldn't be a lot more of a break. My question really is, if we didn't go with option 2 and we went with option 1, what are we going to get? Because I think we've all been so focused on what you're proposing with option 2, which is very complete. If we didn't go that way, we would be getting something along the lines of what you see there in the red right now as the modifications with option
Correct.
1. Right.
Correct.
All right. Thank you.
So
All right.
both
Anything
options,
else on this? I know.
Yeah, both options 1 and 2 give you that density intensity item. Remember the two things I mentioned we're trying to recommend.
That we have to do to meet state law also.
It's what the state guidelines talk
State
about for
guidelines,
land
right.
use designation is to have both density intensity standard as well as having a description of the allowed land uses and a location. We don't have either of those with option 1. We would have both of them satisfied with option 2.
But so if we went with option 1, we still have to do location and description? Or is this,
Correct. In option 1, you still end up with the calling somewhere existing community, and inside of that, you can have the breadth of land uses that are allowed in existing community. On
and
any
will
given
that be
parcel.
sufficient to meet the state guidelines?
Our interpretation of that is that the guidelines are wanting to see you designate property for what it's used for.
So you're saying that you guys don't think that would be sufficient?
That would be our recommendation. That's
Yeah.
not sufficient.
So if that's
because
the
it doesn't-
case, then what you have up there doesn't actually have what, if we went with option 1, we actually would still have to go through and get designation and
Yeah.
description, right?
I think in the description of what I'm portraying, and obviously as Supervisor Parks mentioned, the graphic doesn't portray that, but, or I'm sorry, you had, you're kind of combining, you're taking what's in option 1 and you're mixing it over with option 2. So we have a bracket. This is what's in rural, and rural matches up to rural. What's in existing conditions in urban matches up to very low residential down through Parks and Rec, and, well, agriculture and open space are separate. Those match up to agriculture and open space on the other side. So we're just trying to take existing community and urban and give it more definition for what's allowed inside. Rural agriculture open space will stay the same for both.
I understand what you're trying to do
Yes.
by going to option 2. I'm saying if we voted for option 1 instead, would we only get this back with option 1, or would we get, I think staff over here is getting it. You said not only do we have to do this, but we also have to do description and what were the two phrases you used? Description and, besides density and intensity.
The allowed land use. and
Allowed land
location.
use, allowed land use and
And
description.
location.
And location. So allowed land use and location. In option 1, what I see up there, we don't have allowed land use and location.
That's correct.
So the table on the left does not actually adequately describe what you would bring back to us in not the numbers, but even in terms of format. It wouldn't adequately describe what you would be bringing back to us if we went with option 1.
That's correct. We're making a recommendation for the things we think are needing to be fixed, and the 2 is what we would say is the way to fix it. Now, on 2, do we need to have that many designations? No, not necessarily. We could combine some, we could break some apart, we could change the densities, intensities, et cetera, to make this better fit your needs.
But I think from our at least from my perspective, as I looked at it, it was sort of like you were giving us 2 options. You were recommending option 2, but you were saying option 1 was looked like as an option at least. But you're really saying option 1 isn't an option because it's not complete.
It ultimately becomes your choice for what level you feel comfortable with as far as the descriptions.
But from your recommendation, it'd have to have more. If we went with option 1, it'd have to have more information to it.
But you're recommending option 2.
I think option 2 still
Option
needs
2.
to be, I think where you're going is in the right direction, but I think that we need to go over the data of what's in chart number 2 more.
That's right.
I don't think this is the final version. I think that there's some more that needs to be added to it.
I agree with that. I just want to get that. I think I'm just trying to clarify the answer to that question. If we for some reason we decided to go with option 1, it would have to be structurally more specific than even this. It'd have to give us issues like description and location.
Option 2 is really making option 1 meet all the requirements. That is, you're talking about taking option 1 and making it fit the needs. What you're talking about is that for existing communities in urban is to split out commercial from industrial from residential. At a minimum, you'd probably split those 3 things apart. Now, whether you have more than one residential category.
I'm going to ask my question another way just to get it, because I want to move us on. We really don't have option 1 as an option. Because
if I may, I think option 1 could be an option. Certainly, I'd take away the rural stuff. We do allow, some, utilities or whatever in rural. But what this all boils down to is just looking at existing community and urban. And that's where they've come up with all these other types of designations that fit into what we now call existing community and urban. And we can discuss it. Do we really want to have business parks, in our, do we want those true designations that are being proposed in these 2 existing community and urban? That's all we're talking about. But if we take option 1, they have done an effort to put some type of density intensity in existing community by breaking it into residential, commercial, industrial. If it's commercial, it's got to be 60% building coverage. It has to be at least 6,000 square feet. So I think you have provided the elements that will take care of the issue of density intensity in the existing community and urban if we want to continue to keep those.
Yes, ma'am.
all I needed was a one-word answer, and then we could have had this, and I just was asking. So the way we have option 1, I'm going to ask my question the third time, and if people would let him please answer it. The way it's structured right now is not sufficient. It would have to have more structure to it than that, more breakdowns to it than that, to meet your suggestions for meeting the guidelines, if for some reason we didn't go with option 2. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Great.
Yes. At the minimum, I know there's a lot of categories up there. At the minimum, you're probably looking in existing condition urban, you need to have a couple residential designations, a commercial and an industrial. Exactly. Now we've got a number, we could reduce the number of, so you're basically taking option 2 and you're maybe slimming down the residential choices, taking out the business park, just having an industrial and just having a commercial designation, calling it good on that end. Rural residential fits into quite a few of your communities, the low density and medium perhaps, but maybe not getting into the high density. So that's basically that's all option 2 is taking those 2 middle categories at 1 and giving them a residential, commercial, and industrial. How many of those you'd like to have and where the split is, we could certainly take direction and come back with a choice on that.
I appreciate that it was a good faith effort on your part to come up with option 2 to try to meet what you think are the new guidelines. So I recognize that.
If I can, though, I did hear him say that you can take option 1 and you can just, instead of just like the 1 residential densities, you could have a second one also, but we could keep the existing community and the urban. And I just want to throw that out as a possibility because when you add all these other types of clearly urban uses, business park, general commercial, neighborhood commercial, just it gives the opportunity to do more development in the unincorporated area, in my perspective, and it goes against the guidelines for orderly development. It says you put the industrial and the business parks and the general commercial in the cities, and having those land uses will allow for, I believe, more development in those areas. So that's one position on this, and I just would keep it open that we do have the ability to use the current ways that we deal with it, which is calling things existing communities, urban, separating them out. And it, I think, really focuses on the fact that the unincorporated area isn't an area for urban development.
But we do have, Mr. Chair, we do have commercial, industrial, and in the El Rio area.
Yeah. You know, when we were doing the marijuana dispensaries, to realize in the entire East County, there was only one location where you can put one because we don't have commercial development all over, right?
But I think they would give us some guidelines here in the El Rio area, especially in the western part of the vineyards, them to think about.
Okay. Anybody have anything else that you want to ask the consultant while he's on? Like I said, this one was going to be, we were going to have significant conversation on this, and we did, right? All right, we'll let you go back to your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. All right, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, after we have the public comment. And we'll go to the next stage. We're looking at Chapter 4, Development Constraints. So as part of the last few chapters, we looked at answering the question of how much could be built in the county under the current general plan, how much might we need in the future, and how do those two things compare. Chapter 6 provides a range of population projections. These are not meant to be targets in any fashion, but just look at what people have been estimating as far as future growth, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we wanted to look at what is the capacity. And at previous meetings, the board had directed that we look at what could be built out in the county, looking at the wide range of development on vacant land, the use of underutilized properties to meeting their full potential. And so that's part of what we went through. Now, the scheme of things, Chapter 5, we'll tell you a little bit more about this, but we want to just talk about the constraints piece of this. When we're looking at development potential, we look at what are some constraints on the future development. This is a list of items that were originally looked at. The ones in red are the ones that were currently applied to the numbers that are being presented today and also are inside the alternatives report. So as you look at these, the question is, why are some of them gray? When you look at a development model, there's a wide range of items you could look at. You try to match up as much as possible with things that might be looked at in the future for your housing element and your housing needs in the future. We looked at infrastructure, and this is one item that is covered in a housing constraint, but the issue we're having right now is we're evaluating the potential in the entire county as opposed to a more targeted look at what might be possible for infrastructure improvements in the future. Something that we'll have to get into more detail as we update the housing element, but for a broad county look, evaluating the capabilities of expanding sewer to every little piece of property became too large of an issue for the broad look at capacities. We talk about general plan transportation policy relative to level of service F and how that pertains to future developability. That was left out at the time because of potentials for changes that might allow for differences in the future, and it was not seen as being a permanent constraint given things that may change in the future. And what we're trying to do is look at more items that give us a permanent constraint on a property. And if you look at things such as steep slopes and floodways, and all these things, like many things in planning, you could argue they could be changed. Could you change a floodway? Sure, with enough money, but it has downstream effects. Steep slopes, could you build on a 30% slope? Probably, but not very affordably, and probably not something you'd want to approve anyhow because of scenic vistas and such. So, greater than 20% slope was considered to be an undevelopable parcel. The SOAR ordinance was in the initial list. It was not used specifically because the modeling was based on the county's existing general plan and zoning ordinances, which are done to be in compliance with SOAR. And so SOAR is already built into the analysis that was done based on the fact it uses your existing zoning designations. So that was already considered to be part of the constraint package. Sphere of influence, and we'll talk about this later when we show some numbers. This is an interesting thing as you look at future development, because if you look at SCAG and what they say you're going to produce, it's not a whole lot of housing units, but there's some part, and through the guidelines for orderly development, it's encouraged that future development go into the cities, that if it needs sewer and water, that it should connect into a city. So some part of the sphere, although we did look at it, it is county land. Somebody could come in today and develop on it using the county zoning, so we didn't exclude it or didn't use it as a constraint. We allowed it to develop as far as part of estimating the future. But in actuality, a lot of this will probably be taken into a city boundary in the future, which is also part of why you have lower long-term growth in the county, is because a lot of the more urbanized development gets taken into the city boundaries. And sensitive habitats were based on the level of information we had. We didn't have that site-specific and information set that would allow us to exclude properties at this point. Obviously, as you come in with individual projects, you have the ability to do site-specific biological work, and that would certainly be a constraint on development, or at least be something that would have to be mitigated against. So what do those look like in a broad sense? Looking at the county as a whole, one of the constraints is incorporated cities. So if it's in the cities, it's not part of the jurisdiction of the county and not part of the development potential for what we're looking at, although for the entire county, that is part of the fabric of it.
Could I ask a question that your report refers a couple of times to AB 1317, or 1397 rather, 1397? That says that sites identified to accommodate lower income RENA allocations must be served by water, sewer, and where do we use that as a constraint, the fact that we are required to have water and sewer for the RENA allocated numbers?
When we get to the update of the actual housing element and some of the land use alternatives we'll talk about, we're going to have to get down to that kind of level. What we're doing at this point is to do a broad look for countywide and see, do we have enough potential? I think part of the question was, do we need to redesignate much? The answer from the model is no. You have adequate capacity to meet the development potential that the projections show might happen. It doesn't matter which one we pick, whether it be Skag or all the way up to the Woods and Pool, you have enough developable land to cover those. So from one question that I think we were tasked to look at is, do we need to make changes overall in our proposed development? Now, we use zoning. I know I've talked about my option 2 and coloring the map in. We had to use zoning to do that kind of projection because we didn't have the general plan designations to model against. But that's how we came up with the numbers for the future.
Even though they can't be used for RENA?
Well, what we will
that's
do,
okay.
Yeah, again, when you look at the entire county and the potential for each site to have sewer or not, that was too big of a task to take on for a countywide model. When we get to the RENA, yes, we were going to have to actually identify site-specific locations. We're going to have to provide for the density appropriate to provide low-income housing. We'll have to provide that they are buildable sites, which includes the fact that they have access to domestic water and wastewater services. So as we go, this is our big picture look to see, do we have it covered? And then we will dive down later when we get in the housing element, because HCD, or Housing Community Development, will want to know that's the parcel that we have proposed, that is the zoning for it today, or the zoning that we are going to change it to, this is how many units can you have, this is the sewer connection that's available, or what would have to be done to achieve it. And so that whole litany of items you're asking about to prove viability of those sites will come in the next step when we get into the housing element write-up itself.
Okay, and we're being asked as a board to approve the proposed decision that staff made and consultants made on which constraints we want to utilize when we're doing the potential development potential. And staff has chosen steep slopes and
Another way to say it is staff has chosen things that are fixed that can't be likely to be changed.
floodways
Right.
and steep slopes. Okay, but then we're being asked to approve those, and I'm just looking at, there's other constraints out there that would significantly reduce the amount of development potential, real honest-to-goodness constraints, right? And for example, like ESHA, we're not allowed to go into environmentally sensitive habitat by state law, earthquake faults, and we've got Santa Susana Field Lab contamination and Halico contamination, and we've got airports and airport buffers, and I can go on. High fire hazard area. So there's the ones that you've selected, to me, end up allowing for a higher development potential, even though you say it doesn't really matter. We have certainly already on the books sufficient development potential. So it's hard for me to agree that these are the two development constraints, not to even mention the guidelines for orderly development. We don't build in the spheres. It's a LAFCO law. You go to the cities. I mean, all those kind of things really are significant constraints. And then just to finish is that reading your report too, we utilized more constraints in the last RENA analysis. And as a result of that, it states in the report that SCAG reduced the RENA allocations because they saw that we had these constraints on the land. So I'm just not comfortable with saying we only have 2 constraints that we're going to look at. And also with state law saying you got to have sewer. Should we then say, okay, we're going to allow for analysis that says as if we have sewer, even though all our guidelines say we don't sewer the area?
When you look at your future sites, we will have to determine which ones are likely to happen and which ones have the potential for the infrastructure. But beyond that, which ones are places people want to live? Which ones are near a job? Which ones have transportation access? There's a whole range of things that can be looked at in addition. When you look at a lot of the constraints, I can just flip through really quickly. Quite a few of the topics, like even some access to sensitive habitat information we had, either the flood zone or the steep slope zones took out, in the marine coastal areas, took out the majority of those sensitive sites. I'm not going to say it's 100%, but we weren't getting, the more constraints we added, we didn't get that big of a difference in numbers for some of the things we looked at. We did have some information on sensitive habitats. We didn't do contamination. The high fire risk actually matches pretty close to the
steep
slopes.
And then you look at, like, Ojai has some constraints because it's in a air quality area that has low air quality, and yet the greatest number of units are going into Ojai. So if we considered, for example, the air quality impacts in Ojai, we wouldn't be putting the thousands, or saying it has those kind of development potential. So I'm just putting that out there, saying I'm not comfortable with just those 2, steep floats and floodways as the development constraints, because there are significantly more, and then it's why you end up with a number that's twice the amount of development, twice the population in the unincorporated county, because the constraints were so minimal.
Well, there's
Thank
five constraints that were actually applied.
Great, thank you. But she didn't ask a question. She was finishing her statement, and I want to ask a question in another way, and that is what I heard you say at the beginning of this is we're doing this constraints analysis to determine the fundamental question: do we have enough land zone for development in Ventura County to meet our projected housing needs? And the answer is yes. Even if we added these other constraints, it's such a significant difference in numbers. But when we go to actually approve a project, or even when we go to, and I'm asking this of both staff and you, and number one, I want to make sure that the first thing I said is correct, which is we're using this exclusively to determine whether we have to rezone more land at the beginning of this sort of general plan process, or hey, we need to find some land to rezone, maybe have a SOAR vote or whatever, right? So that analysis says no. Then when we do our housing, when we do the housing element part of it, and when we do our housing constraints, and when we get our RENA numbers and we have to say, okay, what is our ability to meet that? That's when we use the more complete list of constraints, and that's when we actually come up with a different number that is a more refined number that at that point in time. Is that how you see it? And staff, is that how you see it? I'm going to start with staff.
Thank you, Supervisor Bennett. That is the way we see it. It's the housing element is a much more refined approach where we have to do the EIR. When we talk about zoning to 20 dwelling units per acre, and we have to find enough to meet the RENA numbers, right? We're looking at that very careful for sewer, for access, for capacity, and that is very much a drill down. One is not the exercise of where we are right now in the general plan process.
This is simply an exercise on rezoning from your perspective. And just if I could have do you see it like staff just said that?
Your summary, sir, was right on.
Thank you.
But I just say we are given the option. That's one of the questions coming to us. Are these the constraints? And I just think I want to send a message, and that message is the guidelines for orderly development, which respects SOAR, which respect the sphere of influence, and as well as the requirements on sewer and domestic. So that's why I won't be able
Great.
to
Could you
support
go-
the
could-
ones that is here. And I don't.
Could you go back one
Yes.
slide, please? I am happy to go on record, have us go on record and say, those are all the constraints that we will use over time in terms of deciding where we're actually going to build housing, or even what number we're going to use. Those are the ones we're going to use when we're at the more refined level. But the ones we're going to use at this level, because we would be taking, if we tried to put all those constraints in right now, you'd be going parcel by parcel by parcel to see if they met all of those constraints. So I'm happy to address.
I'll tell you, it's a push of a button for the SOAR ordinance, because it's all lands designated open space agriculture rural.
If I could, just let me just finish.
For the sphere of influence. So it isn't because of the intensity of the work that you'll have to do. Some of that's a push of a button.
These all, sure, some of them are, but the bottom line is these are all,
I
we're not
contend
saying.
most of them are.
We're not saying we're not going to use these constraints. We're just saying at this level of analysis, and we're just trying to answer the question, do we need to rezone more land? We're saying we don't need to apply all these constraints to answer the question, do we need to rezone more land? The answer to that question is no, we don't need to rezone more land, right? So, but that doesn't mean we're not going to use these constraints. So I just, if we can be sensitive about writing that there are other constraints that are going to certainly apply whenever we use the next slide or whatever, I think that'd be helpful. So I don't want to imply that we're not going to use these restraints, but that doesn't mean that it's not rational to use the analysis that you use in the next slide, if you can go to the next slide, please, for the calculation of just are we okay in terms of rezoning land, right? So, all right. So I think we should move on here, or we'll be here for a long time unless anybody has anything else. Good, right? All right. Good. All right.
Just to show what and again, some of the other constraints we talked about fall within these footprints because they're so large, but with the incorporated cities, looking at the coastal zone, which was left out because of the heavier restrictions on development. There is some development potential in there, but it's not significant. Floodways, regulated floodways. Looking at tax exempt properties, that is things that are owned by a governmental entity or managed by a governmental entity. And then steep slope overlaid on top of that. The steep slope, between those two, that eliminated the majority of the area, leading you to figure 4.1 that matches up with what we had looked at. Okay, that's chapter 4.
Okay, so before you go to chapter 5, all that in chapter 4 doesn't say that is what we're going to build. That just says we know we have enough that we don't have to rezone land. It doesn't say that's what we're going to build in any way. It won't be in any place in the general plan that says our intention is to build to that development capacity number, correct?
No, this simply gets us to what you said.
Thank you.
And the previous slide of the map, for example, Oak Park is surrounded by open space, happens to be owned by the Rancho Simi Rec and Park District. We're hoping it will stay open space, but in this analysis, because it's open space, it's got a zoning that allows for development, so we're considering the open space park as development potential. And I think that gets kind of to the issue of the realistic aspect of this, and then the message, which is my key thing that we're sending by saying it has development potential.
It has development potential to the point that a site-specific analysis has not been conducted, and that site-specific analysis can, of course, limit significantly what could be developed. I think to answer some of what you're asking about, so we had about 44,000 parcels within the unincorporated county, and we evaluated every one of them in some sense. The items, such as you're talking about the land trust, we searched for items that were tax exempt as a way to try to find those. Now, if that land trust is taxed, it wouldn't have fallen out with that kind of analysis. Now, if you know of significant areas, we can always add those back in manually. But that's how we came to our broad look at that.
The way to say it is they have development potential at this level of analysis, but when we do further analysis, which we will do before we decide at all where anything's going to be built, that's when additional properties will fall out.
So, Mr. Chair, taking the three constraints, the physical, infrastructure, and regulatory, that's what we're looking at. That's exactly right.
Can I ask a clarifying question? You wrote off the coastal zone area, and can you repeat why you did? Because the Coastal Commission changes their rule books and so forth, so I'm just understanding.
Recommend.
Our discussion on that was we were not looking at that because the extensive regulatory environment in that area, it was hard to pinpoint exactly which ones could be developed, not developed, and there weren't that many available developable parcels after you took out other constraints in that area. So it didn't change the results significantly in looking at that. And we did look at some of the other constraints. The model will allow you to turn it on and off, and a lot of the numbers didn't change notably where we'd have to bring to you that you couldn't cover what you're trying to cover.
And what we're looking at, mostly the focus on residential. I'm not clear on the development potential on vacant commercial and industrial land section, which states that you're using agriculture and open space is considered vacant land. Is that accurate? Do I have that right? For this analysis?
Agricultural and open space as defined by the tax assessor. The only thing that we used for commercial industrial were things that are in Ventura County zoning code as being commercial or industrial.
Okay.
So they are not designated agriculture, and we're not using it for commercial use.
They may be in current use as agriculture.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I have an industrial lot with a farm on it. Good question, because that could be confusing using the same terms over again. Chapter 5 looked at development potential. Again, not a perfect model, but when we're looking at an entire county, it's meant to be the 30,000-foot view, as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, to try to get us into that area. Now, there's two main terms here, holding capacity and development potential. Probably this graph, it will show that better. Holding capacity is just the raw, what do we have available to us? So if we looked at vacant parcels and underutilized parcels, that is our overall holding capacity. That's just the raw amount of things that could be built with no constraints added to it at all. So when we looked at vacant parcels, this again was on the assessor's use codes. It picked out things that were currently designated as vacant, open space or ag. That's not their zoning designation, but that's what the assessor is taxing them based on, the actual use. Underutilized parcels were based on the parcel's potential for development. So if I had a zoning that required a 2-acre minimum lot and I had 5 acres, that lot can really hold one additional house if one's already there, or 2 new ones if they haven't had any. So it's just a simple math factor. For commercial and industrial, we looked at the county was able to acquire building footprint information through your GIS department, where we actually could measure the footprint of building space on any parcel. And we were able to look at that building coverage versus what is allowed by the county. And if the building footprint was less than 50% of what was allowed, we considered it underutilized. Now, to our holding capacity, then, we subtracted out the development constraints we just went through. And then overall, that gives us our development potential looking forward in the future. So that's the broad process. There's all sorts of ands, ifs, and buts that went into these Excel statements, but that's what we're basically looking at as we move forward through the model. So from development capacity, again, based on broad constraints, did want to note that there's some possibility, the difference between legal lots and the things that have assessor parcel numbers to it. Development potential is based off maximum density intensity. This is important. We wanted to see what our maximum potential was. Now, most properties don't build to their maximum allowed use. If it's 4 DUs per acre, a typical subdivision comes in at 3.5 or something like that. So there are things in the model that overestimate. There are things in the model that underestimate. But all in all, it gets you into the ballpark of seeing that you have enough coverage, which is where we were trying to go. Now, we've got big numbers. Now, as we look at the different constraints, some of these make big differences. Steep slope makes a huge difference if you include it or don't include it. Some other ones don't make much difference at all as we add the back in. And again, we show you holding capacity versus development potential. So you can see that, for instance, residential, we have 34,000 in our overall holding capacity for both undeveloped and vacant sites. But you see that drops by about half as you get down to development potential. So after we add in the constraints, it drops quite a bit. We also did a calculation for accessory dwelling units, which pretty liberal as far as locations that could accept it. You basically had to exceed the minimum lot size of your zone. So if your zone required you to have 8,000 square feet and your lot was 7,000 square feet, we didn't count you to get an accessory dwelling unit. If you were over 8,000, you got one. So a fairly large number. This slide's important because it shows you the difference between looking at the rural agricultural open space areas and what could be done there. Now, this was done off of the existing lot requirements of your zoning code, and therefore it didn't require any change of zone. It would be something that's allowed under SOAR. Those areas have not seen any kind of development potential, and it's not likely that they're going to see anywhere near this kind of potential. So in the last slide, we talked about 17,000 some odd dwelling units in our development potential. You can probably look at about that 10.5 that's in the rural agricultural or open space areas as not really yielding that many units. And so your real development potential here is probably more in the 7,000s category as opposed to the 17,000s.
Well, also, isn't that an estimate? I mean, your ADUs just started, it's like 4 months of data, right? And did you extrapolate that, or how did you get to the 13,685 accelerated dwellings for development potential?
State law allows you to put an accessory dwelling structure on any legal conforming lot. So we basically just looked at all the lots. And again, the criteria was if you exceeded the minimum lot size of your zone, you could have an accessory dwelling unit. Will that happen on that many lots?
No.
In the scheme of things, you know, if you got 100 a year, you were probably doing pretty well in the unincorporated area as far as numbers. The numbers have been pretty low historically as far as what's being produced. But again, accessory dwelling units are something the state is pressing. They are advantageous for meeting some housing needs that aren't currently being met in a lot of the state. And so that's why the state has gone forward with easing those kind of rules for getting accessory dwelling units. I guess the main point out of all this is we give you a big number for your potential. Even if you took off those other numbers and just sat with that 7,000 number on top, you still have more capacity by twice over what you're projected to grow by the year 2040.
And I think if we had the constraints that included, state law that requires that it have sewer, the SOAR ordinance, the sphere of influence, and the guidelines for orderly development, you wouldn't have even that number that says 10,585 in ag and open space and rural lands, because that would cover all of that with constraints. And then you'd be focused with saying, in our county, we'll put residential on residential land use designations. And that is ample.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question? Most of those, don't we also have LAFCO constraints there? I know we have, because of the
And LAFCO.
because of the infrastructure, because of sewage, and et cetera, et cetera. And really, the county, we're not in the business of building residential units, or
Exactly.
tracks for that matter.
Most of the
LAFCO
areas in the county unincorporated didn't have that high density that would actually even require sewer.
Yeah.
Now, if we're talking about low-income housing to meet our RENA needs long-term, we're going to have sewer connections or something to handle that. But for a lot of the development that can occur in the county, you don't require sewer and water. And today, you could pull a building permit in the sphere of influence of Oxnard, if you so desired, under the county's jurisdiction. Now, whether the county approves it or not would be subject to all of you. But that's why we included sphere in the calculation, is because it is possible.
It's unincorporated Del Rio, 9 acres, we have sewage, it's unincorporated.
Yeah, other than farm worker housing, what you find in the ag, open space, and rural are the higher income homes, right? It's in the where you're going to find your apartment stuff are in the existing communities and the urban areas under residential land use,
Anyway, okay.
where they have sewers, for a lot of them. Some don't.
As we go through the housing element, the challenge of finding suitable sites that can produce 20 units per acre in the unincorporated county will be a main challenge for the housing element. And that will require sewer, will require park and rec facilities, will require transportation facilities, a whole lot of things that we have to look at.
And that is really informative, you know, to have that information, to have that data, to say, well, yeah, but we know we can do it in El Rio, we know we can do it in Saticoy. Those areas that are designated already, that to me is helpful information instead of kind of the blanket, you know, let's see what happens if we put them everywhere and how many numbers, you know, will that mean?
The final is just that same breakdown for accessory dwelling units as far as the spread. The final piece of the puzzle was looking at legal nonconforming parcels. That is typically a house that sits in a parcel that's designated for an industrial or commercial use. Could be a legal nonconforming property. So these have some development potential, although many houses are converted into the structure that they're in the zone for. A real estate office or law office in a home would not be unheard of in many places. So, but this is a look at just how much of that is available out there. The number's been adjusted. It's only 30.4 acres out of the unincorporated area.
I know you're moving on here now. Do we have, you know, you've listed the development potential capacity for residential, et cetera. Do we have that for the commercial industrial? My understanding, we don't have a slide for that, but commercial industrial is, okay, good, 11.1 million square feet of buildable land, right?
1.5 million.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a lot of space.
Thank you.
Final chapter, chapter 6. Some questions perhaps about what are we looking at? What is all this? What the purpose was to provide a look at the breadth of what the intellectual pool out there is seeing for the future of the county. Now, the projections in here are what our economists found, all the entities that are making a good try at doing an estimate, although I will tell you the Woods and Pool number, they haven't updated that in a long time, and it's based on a straight line projection of some older times when things were booming better. So I would probably throw the one out on the top end, but it is out there as far as something that's used by some commercial entities. We also brought back a new estimate from SCAG. It's a draft number. We know the last time we were with the board, we had a 2016 projection. That wasn't seen as being that advantageous for the county. They've now had an updated number which has redistributed a lot of the potential growth, more so into the incorporated communities and less so into the unincorporated communities. The number we're looking at through 2040 is only a growth of about 3,600 persons, so a very low number per year as far as what SCAG is currently projecting. Now, we don't have a breakdown yet of the income basis, so we don't know, for instance, right now what the very low income kind of things are. So we can't get into that kind of discussion quite yet, nor do we know for sure that they're going to stick with this number. They are subject to challenges. A city could challenge, and that may bump some numbers one way or the other.
At your first report, it was over 10,000. And now it's at roughly 3,600.
3,600-ish.
So what was the reasoning behind that change?
Most of it was because they reallocated it to the cities.
Okay.
There was some.
I think
By our request?
another way to say it is I think they, for the first time, recognized our guidelines for orderly development. Instead of just saying Ventura County is going to grow by X, and Ventura County's unincorporated area population is 11.5% of that, so they're going to get 11.5% of the growth. Well, if you do that, you're not following the guidelines for orderly development. We're saying we're primarily growing in the cities, and there'd just be...
No, I understood. I
So-
just didn't know if we had asked them to recalculate it based on that.
I don't know if I have no idea whether we did, but my understanding is this is the first time they've actually taken that into consideration, right?
Thank you.
So what is the growth again per year? What was it? How much? Oh,
At 104 persons per year.
tell me to look. Okay.
Now, when I was saying 3,600, I want to make sure, because the report looks at 2017 to 2040. This table is looking at 2020 to 2040, so those few hundred people are because of that. And the difference in what starting date we had. We took 2017 because that was a known number. The 2020 on here is obviously an estimate. Just a different, how you might want to look at it, but it's basically the same numbers.
The report said like 38, where you're saying 104 now, for example. Is that right? Like
The main report was looking at 2017 as a starting point.
So in the report, the numbers are lower than what you're showing here?
The numbers for this slide here?
No, yes, for that one.
The number right there is going to be lower because it's several years less.
Okay.
The average per year should be the same. So just in the scheme of things, this is how it all was breaking down. So you can see there's quite a difference in the rates. And again, we don't have to pick which one we like better. The point was, if you looked at the ones that are out there, and perhaps California Department of Finance, Caltrans, and SCAG are the ones we would want to even look at consideration. I don't think the Woods and Pool is a modern, updated metric, but it was in the thing that a lot of economists use, so we presented it. But you look at the 104 to 517, and your development potential, although it can be constrained further as we look out, is still adequate to meet all of that. So we're not, and again, we were trying to figure out, do we need to talk about some existing communities might need to expand, we might need to increase densities in some places. We're not looking at that type of thing. We're looking at just how to better refine what we already have.
So you're not saying we're capped by if we only approve 104 people, that we're just not going to build for the next 2020. We're not going to do anything. Or are we doing based on our capacity and making sure that we're able to work with businesses, residential, and so forth, based on our limitations of all the other ordinances and constraints and so forth? Which do you choose?
Yeah, the latter. So these numbers are, what we're doing is saying if we look between this 104 and 517 per year, the general plan designations we have and what's allowed out in the zoning code that the county uses would be able to accommodate those kind of numbers. That's not a growth number. It's not a growth limit. It doesn't constrain you in any sense. Growth limits are certainly something the Planning Commission Board could consider, but that's not what that's intended for at this point. That's just showing you that you've got enough capacity.
Thank you for the clarification.
If I could add, the 104 people a year at 2.73 per household would be 38 houses a year. And we've been talking about units all through that, so it just kind of gives you an idea at 38 units per year, and as it came out to about 2,000 units by 2040.
It's a very low production number
compared
overall.
to the potential analysis that brings in about 50,000 units, right? So it just kind of gives you an idea of what's reality in terms of what we need to meet versus a development potential of 50,000, doubling the population of the county, unincorporated area.
Yeah, we're not seeing anything like that going forward. In fact, the unincorporated area has been shrinking a little, has been declining in population a little in the last few years. So that doesn't show that that's happening, and it should be a very low development potential, at least from residential in the near term.
Right, I agree.
That's what you have in front of you. We're going to give a quick highlight of what's next. In Chapter 7, we're looking at our evaluation criteria. What we want to do with the alternatives is provide some visual cue to what we think are good or better choices. For the policy options that we're going to be bringing forward, you may have something you want to solve, and you may find that there are more than one way to solve it. And so what we'll try to do is characterize these. They're not going to be typically a quantitative measure. It's not going to be 75% gets you 3/4 of a pie, but it's a way for us to graphically tell you, we think this one hits the nail on the head, this one kind of gets you there. It'll just help inform your discussion, but that's all it will be.
Evaluation of what, for the benefit of everybody, when you say evaluation criteria for a policy?
Policy choices.
For policy choices. Great, thank you.
Which will come up next.
Can I question? So if, oops, can you go back to the pie?
Yes, sir.
So if we had more concerns about housing, that would fill up that pie completely? Like, say we had, it would check off more.
Say, what we want to do is find what are major policy issues that need to be discussed. I won't throw one out because I'll say the wrong one for somebody. But, one of the policy choices, say it's a protection for airports and airfields. And we may have some policies that protect development under the approach departure zones. This could be for the military airport, it could be for Camarillo and Oxnard and other airports as well. So we may have some policies, and we'll give you a ranking of how well we think that policy addresses that concern. And we may give you, as part of this, there may be two different ways to do it. They could be mutually exclusive, they could be additive to each other. The purpose is to identify what are some key questions that are out there, what are some different policies that could be added that could address that, and then to have the Planning Commission, the board, give us your indication on which one feels like the right path for the county.
So that would add to that pie.
How do we incorporate the stakeholder engagement with that? I mean, we've done a lot of research that knows what's very important to them as well.
The stakeholder input is part of the AIO report early on, the survey we did. We've also been meeting with our TAC as well as the focus groups. All of their input, and they were asked at times what they think should be fixed or not fixed. All of staff has been going through the current general plan to talk about what they think policy-wise are workable solutions and what are not. In fact, tomorrow we're going to be meeting with Public Works and talking about issues such as water, to talk about how the general plan handles water and what they think from their professional opinion is the best way to go forward on water, whether it be supply or quantity. Some of the items they identify that need to be fixed in the current plan would be some of those choices we would throw up here to tell you this is where we're going and this is why. So that input is very important in framing both the questions as well as some of the solutions. Land use alternatives, we've talked a little bit about what these might be. And actually the development potential discussion we just went through flavors some of this. Because earlier on, we didn't know if we would have to start coloring outside the lines or not to be able to look and provide for our future. Right now, that doesn't appear to be, that's not the case from our modeling that's been happening. What we may be looking at with alternatives are a couple things. One is if we went to some variation, option 1.5, somewhere between those two, and we start coloring in the parcels. We want to actually give them a designation. This is residential, that's commercial, this is industrial. Say we went that way. There's going to be some alternatives for land use probably associated with that. There'll be some parcels where we're not clear. It could go different ways, and we might tell you the pros and cons of that and get your input on how this community area might be designated. That could be a kind of land use alternative. Going to the idea of housing, we're going to start looking at what areas can handle higher intensity housing, therefore lower income accessibility for housing. And so we'll start to bring back some looks at what might need to change for those, which could be very, so I guess what we're saying is we're not seeing a big fabric change for the land use diagram. We're seeing small updates of the different areas as well as the coloring in of the designation map if you decide to go with that option.
Could I ask another question? After going through a pretty extensive study to show development potential, there's a part in here that says that we don't see actually, even with the numbers that we generated, that people really will want to have that, that there will actually be the increase, for example, in Ojai, because people will have to drive so far to get to work. And so one of the alternatives to recommend to actually ignore all this calculations for Ojai because people don't want to drive that far to get to work. I'm just wondering, and so it says let's put them over where people can drive easier to work in the East County. I'm just wondering where that came from in terms of establishing priorities. We're overlaying on the development potential one suggestion, people don't drive that far, but maybe it's because they don't work, or they're retired, or they work in town. But I just wonder how we then layer on top of all that analysis you did to come up with different alternatives that disregard essentially the results of the analysis.
I think the piece you're quoting is more of a conversational, that there are choices. People make choices about where they want to live, and they make choices based on the school they might want to attend, where their job might be, how close the bus is, all sorts of things. So that quote was just an explanation using a physical location of there are choices, and it may not all happen here or there. I know that when we do these models, one thing you have to do is you don't model to exactly meet the need. Even if we're doing a city and we know how big the city wants to be or is going to be, you have to provide choice, because we may have exactly what we need for housing, but nobody chooses to live in one location, or the jobs all go somewhere else.
Brings in behavior into the mix. And I would just say that where we're looking at land use and you throw in behavior, people may not want to drive that far, so it won't really grow that much. And then put it in the East County, an unincorporated area that could be like the Knolls or Ventu Park, which have very steep roads and curvy, and you can't really densify there. So in some cases, we're focusing on land use aspects, the geography, the topography, those kind of things. And others, we're looking at overriding those and going with human behavior of whether they really want to drive that far or not.
We're not modeling for that level of human behavior at this point. Again, we talk the housing element will take that into consideration to some extent, because you have to be able to get to work. You have to be able to have access without necessarily having an automobile. There's other things that go into determining whether it's a good site for that type of housing. And so those behavioral pieces or social pieces will be part of the housing element look. But in a broad sense for the overall county, we're not trying to model individual preferences. What we're just saying is this is out there. It provides more than enough choice. This provides market flexibility, and people can make their own choices and apply. Now, I'll caveat onto here a little bit. I talked earlier about vehicle miles traveled, VMT. There will be implications to living 30 miles away from your job as far as you building a new housing development. That housing development, if everybody has to drive 30 miles somewhere, that weighs into the vehicle miles traveled. That starts to be your triggers for significance. At least it's a consideration the board would take into account as far as the approval of that project in the future. So a little bit of that choice will come as you look towards CEQA, and the thresholds we set will help to identify when that's significant or not.
And I would submit too, like, people don't want to live on Santa Susana Field Lab site. They probably don't want to live on Halico site. So human behavior can also apply to the conditions of the land, as well as whether you want to drive long distances. So it just kind of becomes when you start throwing in human behavior, that can really open up the mix as to what we want to prioritize over the analysis that was done.
Yeah, and we're trying not to throw that aspect into this model, but there certainly does play in people's individual decision making. The last piece I kind of hit on before, this is where those evaluation criteria will be used, which policy strikes a home run as far as answering the question that we had up there. And these questions will come from input we received from the public, staff members, through meetings such as this, where we get notes from the board or planning commissioners. So we'll make sure all those inputs help us to frame what are some key policy questions, and then provide to you a range of policy choices, how we think they answer the call of the question, and then get your input. This falls in both looking at some of your key existing policies. That's the sample on the left side of the page. And then the right side of the page, what are some new policies, things that aren't in the plan today? And this could be on an old issue that has a new fix, or it can be on completely new things such as new policies for environmental justice. So this is not the entire policy document, though. We're trying to provide you with a small component that helps guide what you're interested in, the direction you're looking to go on in policy. And then we'll come back with the remainder of the document and let you know where we've made choices based on that direction. And you'll have the chance to weigh in on the overall document long-term as well as the public.
Commissioner Kessley, and then Supervisor Long.
I just want to make sure at that stage, we then have an opportunity to weigh in on policy issues and issues that we might see with where that policy might go and permeate the general plan and how it could impact
Yes.
the different areas, correct?
That's
So
right.
this is more the 30,000-foot view, and then we'll start to create policy from the 30,000-foot view.
The 30,000-foot view will contain policies that could be put in or things that you'll tell us you don't like. So yeah, you're getting a 30,000-foot view just like we have on development potential, but a little deeper than that. You get some
Right.
actual policy, but not the whole thing. And then as we go forward, we will tell you what happened to your favorite policy in the old general plan, where it's moved to, how you can find it, what it's been changed as, what information you need to see. So you'll get a chance to see all of the policies, but this will give you a good overview of where we think you would like us to go or
Right.
help define that.
And we'll have discussions on the impacts that it could have.
Yes.
Okay.
Supervisor Long.
Thank you. I wanted to understand, it looks like we're trying to either follow suit with Merced County for ag issues, and I'm just wondering why that one and why aren't we looking, what was the choice between that?
Simply word processing format. It kind of looked like what we see yours might look like. The policy choice here is just arbitrary.
Okay. Because what I want to make sure is that we are flexible. I understand borrowing other ordinances and policies and so forth from other counties. I just want to make sure they're going, we're all striving for being successful in that as well.
Yeah, this was just a sample of another place we've done that we thought was close. The words that are actually on there have no bearing on what would happen for Ventura County. They could or could not apply, but that wasn't their basis for choosing. It's just a sample page.
Okay, and in your letter, you were talking about environmental justice. So you'll give us more on the SB 1000 on that policy structure. But you talk about a vigorous and robust climate change. What does vigorous and robust mean? Because I can add those 3 words to, I want that in economic vitality, I want that on water, I want that on so many items. So why did you particularly do that? And we're very sensitive on wording because it means one thing to one person and another to something else. So why?
That was in the board letter?
Mm-hmm. I can respond to that. That's actually was the minute order. That was part of the directive from the board at the last work session. So we included that as an exhibit, that there was a request that we complete a vigorous and robust climate change action plan or climate change policies. But it is one of your exhibits.
And I will push back on that only because if we did that, okay, I need to fix the levees on the Santa Clara River right tomorrow. And what is it also within the constraints of our budget or our economic vitality that we're doing? So, we have houses on the coastal. If Coastal Commission says we're going to go back 100 feet, no other building, there's certain things that go along with that. So I'm just very considerate of making sure that it's a climate change that is appropriate for our area. I'm sensitive on that one.
And it'll be our intention to help walk you through what are some of the trade-offs in all the things that can be done. But overall, you want to have a implementable general plan.
Right.
If you make 300 promises and you can only afford to do 100 of them, you haven't really done much justice to the plan.
Climate change, Mr. Chair, I think is important for the coastal areas because of as you mentioned before.
Right, completely agree. But I just want to make sure we're not over-promising and under-delivering on this.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Okay.
All right, we're close to wrapping this up so we can go to public comment?
Yes, sir. I think that's pretty much what we're. That's just a summary of your actions for later, but that's the end of the presentation as far as the general content.
All righty, great. commissioners and supervisors, any final questions before we go to public comment? All right, great. We'll go to public comment now. Our first speaker is Chris Collier on deck, and if you would come down, please, it'll help us to stay on schedule, is Amanda Fagan. Is Amanda Fagan here? Oh, great. Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Collier.
Good afternoon, board members and commissioners. My name is Chris Collier. I'm here today representing my client, Western States Petroleum Association. In the alternatives report you're reviewing today, sections 3-3, I think 3-4, make a reference to the climate action plan and greenhouse gas emission requirements. This says that they will be baked into everything that the plan will do. There's no specifics yet. And my understanding, if I'm hearing all this correctly, is that we're not quite to the point where those detailed regulations are written out. So as we consider that part of the process, I'd like you to consider the following. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. Our economy currently runs on petroleum products. There are nearly 40 million people in the state, 26 million passenger vehicles and light trucks, and over 1 million transport trucks. All that adds up to 48 million gallons of gasoline and diesel consumed every day, or 2.5 million gallons consumed every hour. That's a lot. In our best estimates, Federal Energy Information Agency says in a report from the last year of the Obama administration that in 2050, longer than this general plan is intended to last, we'll still need nearly 80% of our energy needs from fossil fuels. So if realistically we still need oil and gas to power our economy and will into the future, we have to consider not just the climate impacts of local production, but that of global production. California is a net energy importer. I've said that in front of the board several times in the past. We produce only 30% of what we consume in the state. 70% is imported by rail car and tanker ship. There are no interstate pipelines to bring us supplies from the rest of the country. So if California stopped producing oil, replacing what we use each day, and remember, wind and solar don't quite scale to replicate oil, that would mean we're welcoming 588 more tankers each year to our major ports, or almost 300,000 more rail cars or rail terminals for oil and gas. These transportation options have a larger carbon footprint than producing at home. So the reality is producing oil and gas locally in Ventura County means doing so under the most thorough regulatory framework to ensure environmental and human safety and also reduce our global carbon footprint. So that global versus local impact of our carbon footprint needs to be part of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Fagan. On deck, Lynn Jensen.
Good afternoon, members of the Board of Supervisors, Planning Commissioners, and Mr. Powers. For the record, my name is Amanda Fagan, and I am the Community Planning Liaison Officer for Naval Base Ventura County. According to the recently updated Economic Impact Assessment, Naval Base Ventura County has an annual economic impact of more than $2 billion within Ventura County and supports more than 20,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs, over 18,000 of which are Ventura County residents. The Ventura County 2040 General Plan Update presents an important opportunity to implement the strategies of the Naval Base Ventura County Joint Land Use Study and the recommendations of the Air Installations Compatible Use Zone, or ACUS study, to incorporate key military compatibility components, such as noise contours, accident potential zones, military training routes, and special use airspace. On page 3-3 of the public review draft of the Alternatives Concept Report, it acknowledges the state requirements to incorporate policies to address military compatibility, and we appreciate the recognition of the need to preserve land use compatibility with Naval Base Ventura County within the general plan guidelines, guiding principles. The Joint Land Use Study issue LU8 identifies the potential for undeveloped agricultural land near NBVC operational areas to be developed with land uses that are potentially incompatible with NBVC operations. Joint Land Use Study LU8A suggests that JLIS jurisdictions incorporate ACUS compatibility criteria within general plan and zoning ordinance updates. Considering this and other Joint Land Use Study strategies, I posed a question to staff as to whether it might be appropriate to consider airfield noise and safety zones and associated compatibility criteria within the constraints analysis included in Chapter 4 of the Alternatives Concept Report. Given the board discussion to date earlier today, during this workshop, I simply call your attention to the ACU's noise and safety criteria for future consideration in land use density, intensity, and lot size decisions in order to consider military compatibility within the general plan. For ease of reference, I have provided copies of 2 brochures from the economic impact assessment to the county clerk and planning division staff. Thank you for your time and continued collaboration with Naval Base Ventura County. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Jensen. On deck, Trevor Zerhut.
Good afternoon, Lynn Jensen with Ventura County CoLab. And we have several comments to make on the General Plan Alternatives Report. First of all, we support the 3 new elements that are being proposed here: water, agricultural, and economic development, being standalone chapters. And I think you've heard that from many stakeholders that have showed up at the meetings throughout the process. The economic development chapter needs to focus, we think, on 4 priorities. 1, agriculture, including agricultural infrastructure that's going to be needed to meet new demands in the future between now and 2040. Oil resources, as was talked about by one of the speakers earlier, alternative energy, and then commercial industrial infill projects to fund essential county programs, and recognize these infill of commercial industrial is pretty limited based on Chapter 6. So the agricultural element needs to focus on water supply and farm worker housing, and of course the right to farm ordinance to keep our precious ag land from being converted and fallowed. The water element is critical for the county's future as we have this semi-arid climate, and of course there's cyclical droughts going on. We estimate, the estimate that was discussed at the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency TAG meeting was talking about 35% of the land would be fallowed if there were no new water projects in the county. And this could fundamentally change the way the county looks. The disappearing green space, degraded air quality, limited local produce, and also that increased danger of fire sweeping through the cities, decreased revenue to the county general fund. And the crop report that just came out actually today shows how orchards and managed rangelands actually protected homes, in the Thomas Fire. And I think that's kind of remarkable as part of our agricultural community helping the cities as well. Green space and open space are different. With our climate, green on the hillsides means there's been cattle grazing and planting of native grasses, and you see that when there's rain. And that increases biodiversity here. Green in the fields means irrigated lands with our bounty of local produce. The biggest thing we've been talking about really, and the unique need for agriculture, and we've been talking about this for decades, is farm worker housing. And the conditions for farm workers here in Ventura County continues to be heartbreaking. The frustration with the ag industry, they have the solution. We support housing on lands next to schools and easing constraints on sewer and water connections. The alternatives report describes 105 suitable parcels. We'd like to see that criteria on a map and comment on the locations. CoLab is committed to the general plan process, and we believe the county's economic future depends on a balance between economic and environmental priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. Good afternoon, Mr. Zerhart. On deck, Allegra Roth.
Hello, Supervisors, Planning Commissioners. Thank you for having us here today, for hosting this joint session. My name is Trevor Zierhut. I'm the Community Partnerships Director for Ventura County Economic Development Association, known as VECITA. On behalf of our members and Board of Directors, I'd like to thank you for allowing our organization to actively participate in the process of updating the Ventura County General Plan. We've also really appreciated the opportunity to serve as a sponsor of the recently adopted Economic Vitality Strategic Plan. I'd like to follow up today on our request at the April 17th joint meeting you held. We at VECITA request that whenever possible, the economic element of the 2040 General Plan reflect the Economic Vitality Strategic Plan's recommendations. The tremendous work done by county planning staff and community stakeholders produced a strategic plan that we believe has the capacity to fundamentally and positively contribute to our county's economic vitality if the tenets it established are given the consideration the strategic plan deserves. In recognition of the influence of the 2040 General Plan, will have over the region, I'd like to point to particular sections of the Economic Vitality Strategic Plan that should be included in the process of developing the general plan going forward, including the retention and enhancement of our industrial sector by enabling agriculture to remain economically viable, making strategic investments in education and workforce training, collaborating with cities to develop an accurate, current inventory of available real estate for commercial and industrial development. Also, assuring that policy decisions contribute to the health of our infrastructure, including investment in physical infrastructure that might enhance our transportation systems for a better jobs housing balance, supporting broadband and communications technologies, and adopting water policies that focus on integrating resources, projects, and supply. Finally, we stress the importance of promoting efficiency of interactions with business interests with the goal of improved predictability and clarity in permitting and planning process. Visita looks forward to maintaining the partnerships with your staff throughout the 2040 General Plan, and I thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon, Ms. Roth, and on deck, Sean Porowski.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allegra Roth, and I am here representing the Community Environmental Council, which is a nonprofit based in Santa Barbara working on regional climate solutions in the Tri-County region. Thank you for taking public comment on the general plan update and trying to make this process as transparent as possible. I'm here today urging the county to incorporate carbon sequestration and healthy soils tools into the general plan. And want to highlight some of the notes from a detailed letter the Community Environmental Council submitted on this topic on July 25th. So the CEC has been extensively involved in local efforts to improve our region's agricultural soil health, sequester carbon, and support farmers in their capacity to do this as well. This has been primarily in Santa Barbara County. CEC and our partners, ranchers, farmers, the local resource conservation district, the UC Cooperative Extension, are involved in a variety of programs to showcase and research regenerative or carbon farming practices, including the administration of a compost project through the Healthy Soils program through the state of California. So carbon farming includes a variety of practices that include compost application, riparian restoration, cover cropping, reduced tillage, silvopasture, and several others. So the idea with these practices is to turn atmospheric carbon into soil carbon, improving the health of agricultural soils, which in turn reduces agricultural water demand and mitigates against climate change. And we've been able to see these results firsthand. Compost application, for example, has been shown to increase water holding capacity in soil anywhere from 15 to 30%, resulting in reduced demand for imported water as well. So as California's 8th most agriculturally productive county, and as a region increasingly vulnerable to drought and fire dangers, sea level rise, and saltwater intrusion, Ventura County is in a prime position to tap into existing funding streams and benefit from these practices. There are a variety of funding opportunities and initiatives that the county is an ideal candidate for, and this would be an opportunity to support agricultural stakeholders and their ability to sequester carbon and regenerate soil. Having a policy foundation in your general plan is a powerful first step to leveraging these opportunities, and so we hope the county takes advantage of this unique moment to identify region-appropriate carbon farming practices and incorporate carbon sequestration and healthy soils management and tools and incentives as described in our July 25th letter. So I'll be back in October to make a more detailed comment and look forward to working with staff on this as well. I also want to make a quick comment about environmental justice. I want to thank you for incorporating it so thoroughly into your general plan and hope to see this fulfilled in a more complete manner as the plan is implemented. Thank you.
Before you go away, I was taking notes as you were speaking. And I got composting, reduced tilling, and then I have X's for the two other things that you said.
Sure. Let me go back. Compost application, riparian restoration, cover cropping, reduced tillage.
I'm not getting it. Could you speak more slowly, please?
Oh, sure. So are you looking for the other ones that I was speaking about? So silvopasture, and there are others as well. So there are a variety of sanctioned practices through the national NRCS and also through the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And there's a list online of carbon farming practices that have been around since the 1920s. And there's a variety of research being looked into that shows the benefits of these practices. And I'd be happy to send you more info on that as well.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Porowski. On deck, Bruce Smith.
Good afternoon, board members, commissioners. My name is Sean Porowski. I'm with the Ventura County CoLab. There's been a lot of discussion today about development potential. I think the board should make it their mission to make sure that the general plan turns this potential into reality. The first priority should be to do no harm. There was a lot of discussion about the land use designations in Chapter 3. I think the board should prioritize not increasing the number of non-conforming lots. I think it's going to be important moving forward because the more non-conforming lots there are, the less flexibility you have in what you can do with them in the future. And so the board should prioritize not making that situation worse. Also, I think we should, in the land use designations, we need to ask whether separating commercial use from other land use designations would prevent the development of mixed-use commercial, particularly in an existing community. This would make it more difficult to make efficient use of the land in those areas, especially as we're looking at ways to increase housing in our county. The land use designations should reflect the density of intensities within the different plan areas. So moving forward, when we're looking at different land use designations, we should make sure that they're flexible enough that they reflect the diversity of uses between the different areas in the county. Another way the board can help is to highlight is highlighted in the discussion in Chapter 5. So the alternative report presented different development potential scenarios, but they all assume that property owners will be able to easily subdivide their property in order to take advantage of their theoretical development potential. However, the subdivision process is a discretionary action on the part of the county, and that often requires an environmental impact analysis. This can be a potentially expensive and time-consuming process. If the county wants to see more efficient use of existing land, we need to find ways to make that subdivision process easier. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the population growth projections in Chapter 6. There seems to be an assumption on the part of this board that, of course, the cities are going to accommodate all the growth. Yet, has anyone actually asked the cities what they plan to do? Has the county actually analyzed the city's general plans to see if they share this assessment of future growth? And what's going to happen if the cities decide, no, we're not going to accept a larger share of the growth in the county? I mean, here's a hint about what will happen. The SCAG numbers were less than half of what the highest next growth projection by Caltrans. Caltrans, in turn, was lower than other projections. Caltrans's numbers were based on the assumption that continued massive unaffordability in this county would cause a net negative outmigration of people who are leaving because they can't find affordable housing in this county. By using the SCAG numbers, we are thus accepting that unaffordable housing and losing our talented residents to other areas is a permanent fact of life in Ventura County. If the board decides to accept the SCAG numbers, they should explain to the public why they're comfortable with this reality. If we don't want that reality, then the general plan should prioritize the development of housing in this county and make it easier for folks to do so. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Smith, and on deck, Adam Vega.
Board members, members of the Planning Commission, I'm Bruce Smith. I did submit written comments. I'm not going to go through most of them. Most of them are technical and asking for corrections and clarifications in the report. I'll start with, first of all, table 3-3, overview of the existing general plan. I did note that the description of the existing community designation was incomplete and missed a very important aspect, which is current policy is and to limit building intensity and land use previously established levels. And that is done by the existing zoning. In those areas that are outside of an area plan, a zone change requires a general plan amendment to a very specific map in the plan now. The question was also asked, does the existing general plan, by the way, cover building intensity and population density? It's not clear, admittedly, but it's actually, you can find it. Sometimes it's pointing to the area plan, sometimes it's pointing to separate tables, and sometimes it's pointing to the zoning ordinance, which then has more specific standards. So with that particular diversion, I would also say that the guidelines for early development is not even listed as a constraint, and it is a policy constraint currently, and it should be listed to that list of other policy considerations. Admittedly, the spheres of influence, or actually the overlay zone, or the overlay zone, actually covers the portions of the guidelines for early development, but that's not the end-all be-all. There's a comparison to the existing general plan and area plan land use designations. The table is incomplete, and I noted that. So hopefully staff and the consultant will correct those. With regard to Table 3-8, option land use designations, I'm going to go on a limb here, and I'm going to support staff for the alternative 2, or option 2, in terms of land use designation, with one important caveat, which was offered by the consultant, which is retain a broad category of existing community and urban, and then make those other designations subsets of those. You actually combine both. And I believe what staff is proposing is also much clearer than the existing general plan in terms of where can people find the information dealing with issues of population density and building intensity.
Your time is up. Can you wrap it up, Mr. Smith?
Okay. The big thing on the growth projections, I agree with the consultant. The pool, the woods and pool, should be eliminated. It's certainly interesting and informative to include those all those forecasts in a generalized sense. Wow, the level of detail, however, that they're putting into actually analyzing what each one of those growth scenarios is really detailed.
Time. All right.
So if you have any questions.
I don't have a question, but I do want to say that I appreciate how much time you've spent on going through this and finding some of those technical errors, and I appreciate the openness of the consultants and staff to recognize that you found some things and that they are good improvements. And so just the collaboration and the cooperation between people that know what they're talking about is beneficial for the general public. So thank you to everybody for that, and thanks for your suggestions here today. Right.
Could I ask a question, Mr. Smith? Did you say that you thought the guidelines for orderly development should be a constraint? I didn't catch it.
Well, the list of policy constraints, which are not actually being used in the policy analysis at this point, are nonetheless a separate policy constraint that exists today.
So you're talking about in the whole list of all the constraints, sewer, water, ESHA, we don't have guidelines for orderly development.
That is correct.
And they should be added to that list.
That is correct.
That's what you're saying. Great. Thank you.
You said that. And then just for my clarity, when you were talking about recommending option 2, you said something about retaining existing community and urban separately, or what was that?
Well, there's, without getting into exactly how it's going to look, there can be the broad categories of urban and an existing community, and then they can be further refined and broken down to these other subcategories, still within the context of the general plan.
That avoids the confusion of having people think it applies to rural when it's
Right.
really an existing community.
And
so I appreciate that.
very much recommend that you have a zoning compatibility table, much like the existing general plan. They did that for the current general plan, but they didn't do it for the proposed designation. So a lot of the discussion today was, well, what zones would apply within that designation? And I think that would clarify, resolve those.
Just like to get staff's quick reaction to that. The zoning compatibility chart makes sense from your perspective? Great. Thank you for another good piece of input.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Vega.
Good afternoon, County CEO, Council, and staff. My name is Adam Vega. I'm a community organizer with Cause. We're all joined here together today, tasked with the challenge of creating an equitable and robust general plan, which will benefit the residents of this county. Our rich and fertile soil, mild climate, and access to rail, water, and roads are what allow us to feed the world. A major contributing factor to the negative environmental and health impacts of our county can be attributed to the use of toxic pesticides. We grow some of the most chemically intensive crops here in the county. According to the CalEnviroscreen 3.0, an interactive tool state officials are using to help identify communities most affected by pollution, Ventura County ranks number one, using nearly 858,200 pounds per square mile of pesticides here in the county. Crops using the most pesticides are oftentimes right next to homes and schools. This county should make it a goal for the general plan to focus on reducing harmful pesticides used on farms that are next to our communities and utilize more biologically based methods of pest and pathogen management as a first option, rather than the use of and have the use of toxic pesticides as a last resort, as well as follow the suggestions provided by Ms. Roth regarding the methods of carbon sequestration. New state law SB 1000 requires that the general plan take into consideration environmental justice and the right for all community members to live and enjoy a healthy environment, regardless of race or economic status. Our air, water, and bodies are polluted and are at greater risk to develop a number of health issues which we are yet to fully understand or experience in this lifetime. Toxic pesticide producers and applicators do not pay to monitor, regulate, or clean up the pollution. The real cost is paid by those who harvest our food, our students, and our frontline communities near toxic agricultural activities. By introducing these harmful chemicals into our agriculture and our ecosystems, we are initially taking one step forward and two steps back. What we're doing is breeding pests which are becoming more and more resistant. We are continuing to further degrade our soil and simultaneously killing the natural defenses found in it. I ask that we can work together and focus on crop diversification, which can improve the resilience in a variety of ways. It promotes a greater ability to suppress pest outbreaks and dampen pathogen transmission, which will worsen under future climate scenarios, as well as it'll create a buffer for crop production and kind of a safe haven from the effects of greater climate variability, which we are already experiencing. Increasing the adaptation of diversified regenerative and restorative agriculture management strategies, which are both scientifically and policy-based, must be done in conjunction with farmers, policymakers, environmental justice, and farm worker advocates together. As climate change variability increases, the value and need of resilience will also increase, especially in a production system sensitive to climate variation like our agriculture. So I hope that together we can work to manage our soil and water resources while improving labor conditions and allowing us to protect and retain the agricultural workforce that we have here in the county. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right.
And thank you, Mr. Vega. I know that part of our general plan does call for agricultural buffers, which I think would be helpful too, but I don't know if we've actually got it down to a specific number of feet it has to be for that buffer, but it is something that we are looking at in the general plan. Will help.
Thank you very much. We identified that what we would do now is give staff an opportunity to respond to things they heard from the public, things that they heard here, if they want to clarify anything, or if they wanted to suggest that they're going to do something, so we don't wonder what you're going to do or not do. Either of those things. So invite staff, and then we will have one more round of questioning by the board and commissioners, and then I think we should go into deliberation. But I'd like to make a distinction between questioning and deliberation, because if somebody has a question and one of us starts off on the deliberation, it's just hard to get back to that question. So we'll do one more round of questioning from us after we hear anything from staff. So you're welcome to respond any way you like.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bennett. I just wanted to add to the conversation on some of the recommendations from the public, some highlights that we wanted to share with your board. One of the items is we've been contacted by the Department of Conservation at the encouragement of our constituents that we've been working with to work on with their new software they're developing, GIS software for carbon sequestration modeling. So we are actually going to secure training from them. We're looking at some dates in September, and we're going to do a training with staff, and then we're also going to open it up to have our stakeholders come and learn about that option. The other item that we've done is we've secured a Civic Spark for climate initiatives and our climate program, and we secured that person to actually work and assist on our climate action plan, but also work with particular focus on the health and all policies and the effects from climate risks, and also on the environmental justice component and the health risks related to those populations. That person also has a GIS certification, and she'll be able to head up some of the modeling with that new software. Also, as of today, I was informed that we are shortlisted by the Pew Charitable Trust as part of the Health Impact Project to use health policies and general plans to address health and equity issues. They anticipate announcing the jurisdictions that have secured that award, but if we do, we will get direct training and support to craft policies in our general plan. So those are some of the highlights that we wanted to share with you since our last reporting to the board.
Great, thank you. Anything else from staff or the consultants? We'll put you both on for anything that you might want to say.
Sir, if you were asking relative to some comments been made, Mr. Smith had commented about Table 3.3. We have no problem making that change. Table 3.4, comparison of existing general plan area plans. The column for the general plans should not be placed next to the area plans, so we'll actually relocate that above. It's not meant to be a one-to-one comparison, so that would definitely be fixed as well. He provided clarification what his thoughts were on the option 2 item. I could answer questions if desired, but he seemed to state that. And we could certainly add the reference to the guidelines for orderly development. It is called out in the document, but we could make it clearer in the sidebar that also talks about SOAR as one of the constraints.
I would just, to the extent that it's in that list of constraints, if we have that, which is a question that I have, which is, for one thing, all that development potential, that's being used for analysis right now. Is that going to be actually in the general plan? Does that show up in the general plan or development?
No.
So it doesn't.
No, this is a piece of information that will help us develop our alternatives, and it's an informational piece. It's certainly part of the administrative record, but it would not require being.
But it's not in this, particularly given the sensitivity here, it doesn't have to show up in the general plan. How about the list of development constraints that ultimately will be there?
Well, development constraints will be part of, especially on the affordable housing side of the item. Mm-hmm. Some of the development constraints then may go into talking about policy options that might help to overcome constraints or guidance for how to best apply.
And that list of development constraints would be listed someplace in the whole long list.
Not the whole long list, but as they apply to specific topic areas, we could address
to any particular. But all of those development constraints would be ones we'll consider in the general plan.
The ones we can consider as far as development of policy.
That's right. Thank you. All right. Staff, anything else? Great. Okay. Commissioners and supervisors, further questions? Mr. White.
I have a question of the consultant on population projections. And I don't know if you want to put the chart back up there that shows the wide range of forecasted population depending on whether it's SCAG or Caltrans, DOF, or Woods and Pool. Who's Woods and Pool?
An accounting consulting type firm that does population projections. They often were doing things from a commercial standpoint as far as business development and things such as that. But the item that they showed was based on a straight line projection that started more than a decade ago. So it was a time when the county was growing faster, and so that's why it is higher. It's a simple straight line projection.
So are you recommending to take that out of the further evaluation?
Yes. For sake of clarity, we thought it should be in there for your understanding, but I don't believe it's a fair look at the county today.
And what about the other three? It said that in your document here that SCAG has come up with the 2020 projection that says the percent of population and unincorporated 10.6%, which is down from what it had been in their previous projection. But the DOF and Caltrans still have the bigger number. Does it really make sense to have three projections? I can imagine that for you and staff to do all this analysis of three, do you really need three projections?
We are using the projections as a basis to determine if you have enough room. At this point, those projections don't really have much more purpose for us, and we're not going to assess all three of them. We will, once SCAG finalizes the RETA numbers, we will use those as the basis for an awful lot of work in the housing and land use elements, but that's the only one that'll have a direct analysis kind of play at this point. The other ones are important to take note of, but we won't analyze them separately. For instance, Caltrans and their numbers are applicable because they can influence grant funding and what Caltrans thinks you should have for monies based on your population load. The fact that it's higher than you might have, it could be a good thing because you could generate higher funding.
But doesn't SCAG also take into account transportation in their forecast? Isn't it for transportation planning?
I believe, and I say that because at this point we haven't seen any documentation on how they came up with this. We know they assembled an expert panel, but we don't know what they did.
Thank you.
That leads me to another question, then I'll go to Supervisor Zaragoza, and that is, you're saying we don't need to have three numbers for you, a low, a medium, and a high, so that you can do analysis on those alternatives?
No, we do not have to have a whole range. When we look at our future, at some point we're going to narrow down onto one of these numbers to go forward with. We're obligated to use the SCAG number for quite a bit of what we have to do.
Right.
But as we look at future growth potential, traffic loads, all the other things that go into the environmental impact report, the tendency would be to head towards the SCAG one because it's going to match up with our housing requirements.
So do we need to have any number other than if we were all comfortable with the SCAG number, do we need to give you any other number?
No.
Great. Supervisor Zaragoza?
No, I just wanted to thank staff and the consultants for the excellent work that they have done so far. I'd like to have more information on the environmental justice end of it. For example, today at APCD, we had a report from Mr. Villegas that, for example, over in Oxnard, the climate there is really horrible, especially in central Oxnard, where we have concerns with asthma and other issues. Supervisor Long, those things are really important to me that we get more information, and that's SB 1000, I think is what you said. Also, the health and all policies issue, I think, is important to me. And of course, the climate change over at the coastal areas, I think is extremely important that we look at that. But other than that, I think, that staff did a good job. I think we're in the right direction. And thank you for that.
Questioning stage, any questions? Yes. Commissioner Dukas.
Maybe this is more of a comment, but I wanted to acknowledge the written comments that we received, particularly from the half a dozen or so youth leaders from CAUSE who talked about farm worker housing, affordable housing for farm workers and others. And they two of them brought up an interesting thing regarding gentrification. That is something that, I don't know, it's maybe the first time I thought about it.
Any other questions? Supervisor Long.
Thank you. One comment that was talked about today is schools and the pesticides and so forth. And that we're always put in a pinch because we can't tell the school districts where to put their houses. We can send a letter of don't do it so that we're not liable, but how do we control that? Or how do we to work within those boundaries? Because then you just put farmers in situations of pesticide spraying and so forth, and we have a couple locations like that right now. How do we work on that for 2020, especially if we're talking about farm worker housing? Is that an option that we can do to mitigate? I'm not sure. And then you throw in, well, you can't connect to sewer. What are the flexibilities that we can put in there? I heard it's part of an exception, but I do think that is a unique part that we need to look at, and also the farm worker in the disadvantaged communities. What is it that we're going to do with that? I talked also about we talked about density, at least I did earlier, but how do we work on that so that we do keep our area rural and we can utilize the density in certain areas that can handle that system? I guess that's, as we go through chapters 6, 9, and get into more details, I would like to have those questions asked. And also the healthy soils is important. I think that's an advantage of what we can utilize to support our ag, because if we rip out all the minerals, we're not going to have anything to really be able to grow. So just if we can get some more in depth, because I know we're supposed to accept today 1 through 6, and then we're supposed to agree to push you on to go the rest. But I think there's some questions that will definitely need to be looked at and examined further as we go. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I add just
Supervisor
a bit more?
Zaragoza.
I think Adam Vega made a good point about the pesticides, and I think Supervisor Long mentioned that we need to work with the growers and also the farm workers on the pesticide issue. And the farm worker housing, I think, is extremely important, that we address that, because as I mentioned before in the crop report that we had today, we need workers, and we're desperately losing a lot of workers here, farm workers here in Ventura County, so we need to provide that housing, which I think is extremely important.
Thank you. A question, Supervisor Parks.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, because I think this might be the time to consider it on 4.1 of the constraints analysis. It states that if directed by the Board of Supervisors, development constraints, which are consistent with AB 2158, may be applied to the allocation for 21 to 28 RENA cycle if the county intends to request a RENA reduction for the upcoming housing element update. So is this the time when we want to discuss our development constraints as they relate to whether or not we want to challenge the RENA numbers, or would that be something we would do later?
Supervisor Parks, I believe that would be something that we would do later, because we don't have our numbers yet, but we did hear the direction from the board to apply all of those constraints, right? To have the list of all of the constraints, everyone that meets the Assembly Bill standards, and if the board wants to add the guidelines for early development, that is, as Bruce correctly points out, in the housing element now as a standard that does meet that Assembly Bill as well, so that could be added to the list if the board chooses.
So will the staff come back to us after the numbers are given, and that will give us that opportunity of whether we want to challenge them or not?
Yes.
Okay. And so and at that point is when we'll look at the development constraints when we're appealing to SCAG, if that's what we're going to do.
So I have one, I think it's the appropriate final question for you, right, as we start. And I want to go back to what you said at the very beginning. What we're doing today is not voting to lock anything into stone. It's to give you direction on how to go about the next step. But we're not locking in the numbers that you put up there for samples. We're not locking in even, I mean, whatever direction we give you, what you come back with in October, we can go, all we're doing is giving you direction to get to October, but we're not locking anything into the general plan. Is that correct?
Correct. I want to add a caveat, though. We keep talking about this option 1 and 2. I would prefer to work for you with the conversation that's happened on this 1.5, somewhere in the middle. The only reason I say that is because we have to start figuring out the colors of the map. And if you decide to stay with number 1 right now, when you get to October and you decide you don't like that, we've lost time to adjust to that. It's easy to go back to 1, but it's hard to go forward. So we would need to start with your blessing to investigate, I think, what had been talked about, keeping the rural ag open space state and federal urban reserve, those categories as they are now, to add urban existing communities category, and under that, break those out into a residential, commercial, industrial type thing, and perhaps Parks and Rec as it applies to the community boundary, but still doing the overlay separate. If that was, I described that well enough, we'd like blessing on that if you'd like to consider that.
So, yes, in answer to the question, we're not locking anything in, although one thing is if we said go with option one, it'd be hard for you to go to option two in October, and that we would lose a lot of time. If we go with option two, you said we can all, going back to option one is a lot easier than the other. I'm not suggesting we will, because it seems to me we've come, most of us have come to a pretty good understanding that option 1.5, something in between 1 and 2 is what you're nodding your head, Mr. Smith is nodding his head, and I think that most of us were asking questions similar to that too, and I see staff sort of nodding. So I think we probably have gotten there so that you can color the map. So with that caveat, again, we're not locking anything in here that can't be changed without some delay or some money cost potentially, but we're not voting on the plan. That's the point I want to make here today.
Specifically about what size a lot needs to be or how many density you need to have. No, we're not locking that in at all. That can be changed. So with your blessing to go with the 1.5, what we'll do is we'll go into those locations. We'll look at what the lots are, what the development is, what makes sense for that community, and come up with sets of designations that really fit the unincorporated community fabric.
And I think staff has pretty good ability to be sensitive to sort of understanding the subtleties of the conversations that we've had here and recognizing SOAR, et cetera. So there are some specifics that may come up if we don't do this, but why don't we work our way through these 4 items under 1, which is land use designation, selection of development constraints, and see where we are. And we're now at the deliberation side of this, and I would invite us to have a joint deliberation, supervisors and planning commissioners. Ultimately, we have to vote. Ultimately, you have to vote, but I think we're going to take the lead on this one like we did last time. That's just how it seemed to work.
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor,
can I clarify something? For example, they were asking to approve either option 1 or 2. Do we approve separately, or do we approve 1 to 6, or?
I think right now we're just on 1A, and the land use designation modifications, and if I'm correct, that there's an alternative out there that the consultant referred to as 1.5.
Okay.
And without being more specific than that, I would think that we should start with the motion, direct staff to work with the consultant to use what they understand 1.5 to be for the land use designations.
Okay.
So I'll just throw that out there as a point for discussion, okay?
So,
Since that's what they're thinking of doing, right?
So you want to do a motion for each item?
I think that's the best way for us to
A,
be
B,
clear.
C, and D. All right.
Regarding A, am I interrupting you?
Nope.
Okay, regarding A, I think we just want to make sure there's clarity, and let me know if I'm wrong, that the new land use designations you're proposing are only for the urban and existing community areas.
Careful with that word only, but.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So anyway, is there discussion of, well, I'm going to call it staff's new recommendation. They're not recommending 2 any longer. They're recommending 1.5. All right.
And it includes keeping the existing communities, obviously, in the
That's
urban
what
area
1.5
designations. So
and repeated. All right, there we go. Good. So, all right, I'll make that motion, just in the interest of doing that for the board, and then we have to have the planning commission decide how they want to do that. Lori, can we?
So is the planning commission going to vote?
Yes.
Planning commission has to vote separately.
I would
right?
recommend that they deliberate and vote, and then we, after hearing their deliberation, take our vote.
I would. Well, I'd like to hear from them, but I would
Exactly.
offer. I would like to hear from. I would like to hear from them about that issue, because the last time we thought we were going to do that, but we ended up not doing that. If you remember, the last time we ended up making the motions of doing that. That's what ended up happening. So I was trying to follow the precedent that we followed last time. So anyway.
Okay, I hear you. Commissioner, let's discuss the options we have in front of us. Commissioner White.
Well, as Steve said, the last time we met like this, and it's an awkward way to meet, I must say, we followed the board's, let the board take the lead on the motion, and then we followed up with our own motion afterwards, rather than the way we normally do it. And I think we ought to do that again.
And that doesn't,
today.
and I welcome the commissioners weighing in on the motion before we vote. I want to hear from them. I'm not saying don't do that, but that's the motion. And I said, does anybody have any comments? Nobody had any. But when I say anybody, I mean anybody, you know, all sides. So do commissioners have any comments about that? Mr. White?
I like 1.52.
Is that a different one, 1.52 or 1.5 also? Right. All
Sorry,
right.
also.
Okay. Commissioners and supervisors, any other comments before we vote on this motion? Okay, here we go. Can we have it up on the screen, please, Lori? I'd like to see how Lori wrote that one up. Just 1.5. Yeah, approving staff's 1.5. A very scientifically crafted motion.
It's on 1.A.
With enormous specificity to it.
And that's for the 1.A, so we'll vote each one independently. Yes. Yes. This is 1A.
Right.
That's the first one we're going to do.
So we're going to take separate motions.
Approve staff option of 1.5. We always like to see the text.
Okay, can I have a motion from the Plan Commission?
I move that the Planning Commission approve the same recommendation made by the board.
Second. Got a second? Okay, we have a first and a second.
All right. And then you.
I don't get anything to push.
Yeah, that's right.
I think we have to do I think the commission has to do a verbal.
All right. They're waiting for you.
No, that's planning.
Yeah.
So we have a move by, I'm sorry.
Moved by Commissioner White and second by Commissioner Onstad.
So it's not going to show on the screen.
No.
Right.
Just a voice.
Yeah, I'm not.
Recommendations of the board, 1.8.
Right.
Approving staff's option 1.5.
Just for clarity's sake, does that include, with all of those descriptions that may or may not apply, is that going to be cleaned up? Like some of those designations, it seems like we're creating new designations in that, in the second option.
Yeah, please.
Our understanding was that we were getting rid of the other ones that have been mentioned, like Business Park, and the very high residential, so we're.
Okay, so I'm clear. Okay.
No, that's fine.
Do you,
Anna, do you want a verbal?
could you list them?
Based on the existing general plan, we would include rural, agricultural, open space, state or federal, and there's an urban reserve category in the current general plan. We would then have a set that's based on the existing community and urban designations, and under those two designations, which will be defined on a map, we will have something, 2 or 3 residential designations, depending on what we need for coverage, a commercial, an industrial, and I believe we ended up with a Parks and Rec inside of developed areas, not separate from open space. And we will talk about an open space or a Parks and Rec overlay relative to open space.
And these go in hand in hand with existing zoning? We're not creating anything new?
We're not creating new zoning, no.
Okay.
We'll have as Mr. Smith mentioned, the general plan will have a table showing how the zones you currently have will fit into this new designation.
Okay, well, I can support that.
All right. All right.
Anna, do you need a verbal? Okay. Yes.
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 Aye.
All right. And we have our vote up on the screen, please.
Somebody had 4 of them. I voted.
And I'm glad to see the removal of the business park. I don't think we have those, so kind of bringing in new uses, urban uses, so I'm glad that is no longer a part of it.
All right. Our next item is 1B, selection of development constraints as specified in Chapter 4 of the Alternatives Report.
So does the Planning Commission go first in this?
Anybody can talk.
Okay, so selection of development constraints, do we also have?
We're going to follow the policy of, we'll make the motion as based on what I've heard from the Planning Commission, but anybody can talk first, so go ahead.
Just so that we're clear, the development constraints will also include the guidelines for orderly development. Okay.
But not as part of the analysis of potential development. It will be obviously used elsewhere, like in the housing element, correct? Right.
All right. Other discussion? Mr. Rodriguez?
No, I don't see any hands going up. I would move, follow staff recommended action on 1B.
And if I can comment, even though I'm not on the Planning Commission, so we can just have it out there. Once was on a Planning Commission. I do want to also thank public comments. We received a letter too from Tom Orsini, Ojai Valley resident. And I do want to just read a couple parts of that letter. He says, these new SCAG forecasts clearly show that growth in Ventura County is projected to primarily occur in the cities during the 20-year general plan update planning period. And the achievement of city-focused development is consistent with the goals of both the Guidelines for Orderly Development and SOAR. Without projected population growth in the unincorporated areas to support the need for alternative land use policies, the inclusion of focused growth areas in the general plan update is inconsistent with the current policy and could potentially draw new growth away from city-focused urban infill and into suburban corridors. The possibility of this undesirable outcome would increase if the designated focused growth areas were qualified for streamlined CEQA review. The resulting impact would be increased traffic volumes, congestion, greenhouse gas emissions in some of the most environmentally sensitive areas of the county. The Guidelines for Orderly Development and SOAR are supported by the residents of Ventura County and have been effective at directing growth into the cities during the last 16 years. The inclusion of alternative land use policies and or focused growth areas in the general plan update is not supported by the county's own stated guiding principles and not needed based on the most current forecasts. And the fact is that we are, I think, in a pretty good situation in that we can meet the, at least the preliminary forecast that SCAG has provided us. And that gives us some room to breathe. We may still want to challenge the numbers when they come because we really are, at least our policies to date have been to make sure that we can do what we can to preserve agricultural land and open space in the unincorporated county. When I look at the fact that we have this breathing room and that it isn't really, as mentioned earlier, a very difficult thing to do at all, to put more things in the constraints. It isn't an issue of it being difficult. And so because of that, I think that it gives us the opportunity, particularly if we want to challenge the SOAR numbers, but also to push forward with our principles of development, our guidelines for development, which say, let's do what we can to protect the open space and agriculture lands. We have an opportunity to add those back in as constraints. It is almost the flip of a button because things, for example, like SOAR, it's all in there as a general plan land use designation that can be, if you use those, say we don't want to put development on agriculture land, we can actually pull it out and it doesn't take much effort to do that. if we want to look at things like the air quality of basin in Ojai or the groundwater issue in Santa Rosa Valley that precludes the amount of development that we're putting there, those areas are already identified in the wonderful GIS database that we have with the tools that we have accessible to us. The sphere of influence, which has always been a principle of the county, it's part of LAFCO law to always look at putting the development into the cities, not in the sphere of influence. Another touch of the button, because all that land is part of the general plan designations, and they can be pulled out. We have an ability to do that. If we wanted to, we could say, yes, let's make sure that we include in the constraints those things that we all agree on really are constraints, and they aren't hard to do that. And we know that we've got so much wiggle room because the potential that development potential that has been generated by not putting those in is 50,000 or 30,000 units, which equals 90,000 people, which is twice the amount of population currently in the unincorporated county. So we have this wiggle room. Let's go and push that button, take out those sore areas, take out the sphere of influence areas, make sure that we're qualified with what the law says, which is you have to have sewer system before you can use the RENA numbers. We can push that button. We have the technology, ladies and gentlemen, we have the technology, and we'll come out with a smaller development potential. And that, to me, gives that message to the future proposals that we as a county, as we potentially challenge SCAG, are sticking with the concept throughout the general plan, the guideline for the blueprint for growth. Let us make sure that our blueprint for growth is consistent with our guidelines for orderly development. And this is the first place we can do it, an alternatives analysis that's going to be inside the general plan. We're not required to have it in our general plan. We do need the EIR to have it. But I think this is just a great opportunity. It's not difficult to do. And we're making a statement, and a strong one. We heard from CoLab today that they actually want to see this growth potential, actually looked at for putting houses where it's been identified in this analysis. So there are issues that will come before us if we continue with using something that essentially doubles the population of unincorporated county. Even though we're all saying it will never happen, then we shouldn't be putting it forward. With that, I'm not going to support the staff recommendation on what the development constraints are.
We had a first for the
Yeah.
planning commission. I think we were moving on that.
I'll second the motion made.
Okay. Before we vote, planning commission vote, I would like to make a comment on this issue. We've heard a lot about affordable housing, and we're here to identify potential for development in that regard. Certainly, farm worker housing is important. It's critical for ag to maintain. But on the issue of affordable housing, as a commission, I suppose, as a board subsequently, we've got to consciously stay aware of the word affordable housing and encourage development of affordable housing. Unfortunately, profit margin factors in. The land that's selected for development factors in. Geographically, where that land is at factors in. And so that's going to be an uphill fight from here until the end of time, probably, certainly the end of this time period we're talking about here. It's not just a matter of approving the development without being conscious of what sort of housing is going to be affordable to those people that are needing it. I think geographically, I can think of areas in the county where there are communities now where affordable housing has a potential to be developed. but it's a matter of getting the developers, whether they be nonprofits or otherwise, to look at those communities for that potential, given all the restrictions of the infrastructure, limitations, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, as my companion here, Commissioner Onstadt, would say, and as we've talked about many times, all of that aside, we still need water. We need still need a letter, will serve letter for any house or any development that's going to go forward. So water and developing the water sources is critical to all of this. With that said, we have a motion, and I think we have a second.
And I'd like to comment, since we're commenting on the motions here and stuff, and since we switched the order, I thought you had already agreed that you were going to have us do the motions first, but you're doing the motion first, so let me comment, because I think it makes a difference. And that is, I just want to very clearly say I support the recommendation, the motion in front of the Planning Commission. And I want to be very clear that in no way does this imply we're not considering or taking serious all of those other constraints of sewers and water and ESHA and all of those other things. So any implication that just because we said, hey, look, it's good enough, we just need to do that level of analysis right now, we will do a much more thorough level of analysis when we actually have the housing element in front of us. That doesn't mean we don't care about those things. And in fact, I would encourage the Planning Commission, because I'm going to make it in the motion that we make, and that is that we accept staff's recommendation and we ask staff to emphasize all of the constraints, not just the ones that we're applying right now, but all the constraints are an important part of Ventura County Board of Supervisors' view, or the Ventura County government's approach to development. And I'll very quickly use water as an example. Who would here say we're going to approve projects without knowing where the water is going to come from? None of us, right? But who would say that today we should go through and figure out exactly what parcels can get water, which parcels can't, how viable that is? There's no need to do that at this point in time. That doesn't mean we don't care about water just because we're just saying it just doesn't make sense to do that at this point in time. So I'm just implying doing something that I think makes common sense can be construed as, oh, we don't care about all those things and nothing could be further from the truth. So I support the recommendation. I would encourage you to add that, but if you don't, we will be adding it to our motion.
I think it's important too that we talk about water, because in the 5th District we need water. For example, over in El Rio and Island Acres.
Sure.
We're not going to,
And I just say that comment just proves how easy it is for us to just go down the rabbit hole in each one of these things.
So we have to look at
some point, we do have to look at it. But do we have to do it all? Do we have to look at all those right now? That's what I'm saying. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner White.
Just to clarify the motion, so we're recommending this table 1 with the addition of guidelines for orderly development being added, but not as constraint applied. Is that what what's being suggested?
It's
1B.
1B.
You're recommending the constraint be applied to the chapter.
Recommendation.
Yeah.
Constraints.
Right there.
That's up in the book.
So it would be,
It's on the screen.
It's in the screen.
It's development constraints, right?
yeah, and it would be applying the guidelines for orderly development as a constraint to that chapter.
Yeah, we're adding guidelines for orderly development. We're not applying it as a constraint applied.
He's just asking to make sure guidelines for
I just want to be sure I understand what I'm voting on.
My motion is to follow staff recommended action.
Got it.
Okay.
Need a motion?
Yeah, and that was my motion, and Commissioner Kessley seconded.
Commissioner
Anna, you want
Rodriguez,
to
your vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Onstadt?
Yes.
Commissioner White?
Aye.
Commissioner Kessler?
Yes.
Commissioner Dukas?
No.
No.
No, I think it's impractical not to look at the real constraints we have on water. It's not just whether or not we can build infrastructure to get water. We're going to have, with global climate change, we're going to have less snowpack. And right now with extreme weather, we've got groundwater issues, so I can't support the motion.
Okay, so that passes 4-1.
I'll make a motion for the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, one already.
What's that? Well, I'd like to ask you to add to that, to direct staff to, wherever appropriate, emphasize that the board is going to use the full range of constraints.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's good.
Great. All right, thank you.
I've got direct staff.
I don't see it on my.
Go ahead and add it to, and then I'll support that.
Direct
Great,
staff to
thank you.
emphasize all the constraints are important to the Board of Supervisors?
That's, all the constraints are important and will be appropriately applied. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, as I understand the
Passed 4-0.
motion,
Okay. We're on 1C.
I'm sorry, on item B, and I haven't voted yet, but as I understand the motion.
It came up.
Staff's request that board approve to calculate development capacity using development potential, which reflects the constraints that they submitted, which are those two items. So you're agreeing to that, but in the future with the housing element, you want all the constraints looked at. Is that what the motion was? You're not adding other than the other two that were mentioned, the floodway.
We're adding the guidelines for orderly development. The guidelines for orderly development have been added to the list.
Those aren't added to the item B, which is specific to the constraints for the development capacity. Correct? You're going to continue with staff's recommendation of what constraints to use to calculate development capacity using development potential, right?
Following staff's
requested to do?
recommended actions,
Which
with
is-
adding that caveat about, with adding guidelines for orderly development and adding that this is in no intention to suggest that the other constraints are not important, just that the board is not applying them at this point in time for this very preliminary calculation of whether we need to rezone land. Maybe that's the full way I ought to say that.
Yeah.
Just for the issue of whether we need to rezone land, we're limiting the constraints for, but for all other issues we are. All
So
right?
it is
So-
accepting the couple of constraints that they have used to calculate development potential.
Certainly.
And then you
Yeah,
have a
and
second
just so you
part
know-
a second part of the motion to
Just-
include everything else.
Yeah, and just so you know, you're on record as voting yes, so she's going to have to change that,
I
right?
didn't vote at all.
You had it, it showed up on the screen as a yes,
did.
so that's what I'm saying, you're on
Okay.
record. So if you want to change,
Yes.
you can vote no.
I didn't vote for
Okay.
that.
All right, so Lori, can you fix that? All right, and we'll go on to the conversation. So it's 3-1,
Yeah.
all right, on that. Okay, so it's 1C, and then there's use of development potential to identify development capacity as described in Chapter 5 of the Alternatives Report. I think that this vote would end up being the exact same as the vote we just had on 1B, because it's essentially, once you decide what capacity you're going to use, then you just apply it. So with that, I would make the motion to move forward with staff's recommended action on 1C.
I would echo Supervisor Bennett's motion.
Great, so.
Make the motion.
So the planning commission is going to have the same recommendation.
Same
Right,
recommendation.
okay,
and,
good. All right, anybody want to comment on the motion? Since we both have the same recommendation.
I'll second your motion, by the way.
Okay, so we both have those motions out there. Any comments
we
on
have
them?
No, second.
One way or the other? All right, can we vote on these motions then, please?
Planning Commission, Anna, would you take a vote?
And I would comment too that as your representative on SCAG, they are looking at doing a greater effort at trying to protect agriculture land and not pushing jurisdictions to build on agriculture land, industrial or housing.
Thank you. All right,
I need supervisors to vote on your vote.
did you have the planning commissioners vote, please?
Okay.
He wants you to take the roll call
Sure.
vote. We can vote just electronically while you're doing that.
Sure. Commissioner Rodriguez.
Yes.
Commissioner Onstott.
Yes.
Commissioner White.
Aye.
Commissioner Kessley.
Yes.
Commissioner Dukas.
No.
All right, we're at item 1D, and that is current range of population growth forecasts as specified in Chapter 6 of the alternatives. I'd like to kick this off by my suggestion. I thought we had to have a high, a medium, and a low, and I had that. We don't have to have that, so I'm going to suggest this. If staff needs a high, medium, and low, what I would recommend is that the SCAG number, since it is has been referenced, it's the most landmark number, that it's the one that's been referenced the most, it's the one that has the most heft to it, I guess I want to say, or it's the element that is I've had the wording for it in terms of using that, but anyway, it's the most significant one for us. I actually think that given the range of possibilities, if staff needs it, I would go with a number under that and use that as our target. So one is above it, one is below it, so we estimate that range. So whatever staff comes up with, or if it would be a no growth option, there's been references to the unincorporated area starting to have that problem, but I think it's a SCAG number that I want to focus on there. So that's what I would recommend. But if we don't have to have all three, then just the SCAG number is what I would compare against. But if staff finds that they need a high, a low, and a medium, and if you're sure you don't, then I would just go with the SCAG number. All right, let's leave it at that. So that's what I would recommend as a SCAG number. Happy to see what the planning commissioners think should happen here.
Considering, like the planning commission, consider Supervisor Bennett's comments, but I also would request comments from the planning commission. Commissioner White.
I agree with Supervisor Bennett that the SCAG number seems to be the most thoughtful number that has been presented of the four. And if that's adequate for doing what you need to do to have one forecast, that would be the one.
Any other comments? Can I have a motion from the planning commission?
I see the consultants. You're comfortable? You're comfortable if we go with just one number?
Or Kim might have
I'd like to ask that question before we vote.
You always have the issue with what you do with CEQA and how much you have to look at the uppercase.
That's my concern. So you guys said, yes, we only need one number, but we do need another number
We're
for
going to use
CEQA.
one number for development of all of the general plan side of things. For the CEQA side, you might want to keep a little bit higher.
I'm going to modify my motion, and I'm going to say, let's go with it's the Department of Finance was the higher between the two.
Just keep
Could we put that?
numbers.
Could we put that slide up real quick, please?
So we need one number, is that?
We need three numbers. Yeah, I think for CEQA, I want to give them this. That's what I thought. I thought you were.
Keep the three.
I originally thought that we needed to have that.
I mean.
Could you take us to the slide, please? That is the population growth numbers.
I mean, I could see your differentiation, maybe throw out woods and pools.
There we go. Yeah,
But
so,
keep the three that you have based on grants and all sorts of stuff that goes on.
yeah, I'm just throwing out an option, and maybe people don't agree, but I would go with 517, because if you go with 517 and 104, you're doing 364. In other words, if you go with 517, you're doing everything in between 104 and 517, because you're checking out the ranges. So if you're doing, go 517, go 104, and then go 0.
I think for our region, what is looked at in the Southern California Association of Governments, so that they focus on our region. Department of Finance often goes high, and then Caltrans is probably also being specific to our region. So it's nice to go with Caltrans because they're looking at Ventura County when they're giving their numbers more closely.
So what three numbers are you recommending?
Well, we were talking about putting Caltrans and the Southern California Association of Governments, so you have a ceiling, and then even with SCAG, they may be coming back with a revised number too.
So
that gives you a threefold change.
What's your third number?
I don't think you need three. I think a ceiling, between 104 and 364. That to me looks like something that they could look at.
I think having the SCAG and the Caltrans ones provides us enough flexibility because Caltrans is modeled to the area, whereas
So you don't need three.
Well, DOF is just a straight linear projection off of data they've collected. Caltrans did refine it
Okay,
based on.
so you
what
only
the
need two.
Well, the two would be a good range of
All
things.
right, great. I'll make that the motion then. 364 to 104 would be the motion.
Making that motion?
And I would revise my motion to mirror that.
Okay, we have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, if we can have a vote, Anna?
Commissioner Rodriguez?
Yes.
And our motion is?
The motion, excuse me, the motion is to
I'm sorry.
follow staff recommended action with the
Caltrans
amendment
and
as
SCAG.
stated by Commissioner Bennett.
If SCAG comes in below 104,
104 to
what would your approach
364 to
be?
104.
I think you should reword it to say Caltrans and SoCal.
Caltrans and SCAG.
SCAG.
Okay.
I know, I was just saying that because the emphasis with us at SCAG is trying to, they want to build in the cities also. They want to see, that's where you can get transportation, transit and all those. So they are pushing to do that. If that number that SCAG has thrown out now declines, we'll be able to handle that too. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable if it declines, if it changes, but I'm
So we're
uncomfortable with
okay
sort of, what if it
if
goes,
SCAG comes back with a lower number?
well, if it comes back to a whole lot higher, are you comfortable?
And in addition to that, we have the ability to negotiate with the cities that also agree that development should be, not in the unincorporated areas. So I think it's good to reinforce that.
So the motion is.
The only motion I would be comfortable with at this point in time is say 104 to 364. If something changes, but I think that's what we ought to start with. I'm not interested in
I
moving
was just
them.
asking what your plan of attack would be at that point, but I support the motion too. I just want to have that ability that if we want to reinforce the SCAG's efforts to see that you develop in the cities, as well as our guidelines for early development, we have that option in the future.
Well, and that's assuming that the cities are going to do something, but we haven't talked to the cities to see if they're even doing
That's
density. So I'd really appreciate that we do talk to the cities. I think if we're partnering them with everything else, we should be partnering them with this.
They're going to have their own.
Sorry,
Okay.
is it almost 5?
And Supervisor Long, in the last process of doing this, the RENA numbers, that's exactly what happened. Actually, the City Managers Association of the county got together, and that's how they determined how to allocate the numbers for the whole county. We're allowed to do that, and SCAG's willing to do that. And at that time, the cities took more, and the county, as a result, had less, which was for that.
And the planning commissioners voted, like to have us vote now, please?
Have we voted?
Oh,
No, we haven't
you guys
voted.
voted.
Ask me.
Okay.
Aye.
Commissioner Kessley?
Yes.
Commissioner Dukas?
Yes.
All right. And the Board of Supervisors? All right.
Supervisor Zaragoza?
Okay, and now the last item is to direct the Planning Division staff to prepare Chapter 7 through 9 of the alternatives report as identified. And there are other minor things that I wanted to do, but I think that we'll do them later, right? I know Commissioner Amstad has indicated he needs to be leaving at 5 o'clock, and we're making it just at 5 o'clock.
The planning commission.
Division to come back with chapter 7 through 9.
All right.
You want to do?
Yeah.
Planning Commission?
Planning commission.
I'll entertain a motion by the Planning Commission
hang on.
on item number 2, directing staff. Who wants to make the motion?
I'm happy to make that motion.
Do I have a second? Second. Okay, if we can have a vote from Planning
Can't
Commission.
type that fast. Commissioner Rodriguez?
Yes.
Commissioner Onstott? Yes. Commissioner White?
Aye.
Commissioner Kessley?
Yes.
Commissioner Dukas?
Aye.
And we're directing the Planning Commission to return.
Can I ask a question? We're going to be dealing.
Could you put the vote for the board up, please?
Yeah. We're going to be dealing more details, and the question I have is if this is still beneficial versus if we should be having a planning commission meeting, which I want to make sure we're hearing the votes versus will I just go with my supervisor. I'd really like to have these separate. from the more detail of chapters 6 through 10. I just want to vocalize that so you understand where I'm coming from. I just think that we'll get more information by it.
I second the motion.
I second.
I would,
I third.
can you, my light won't come on.
You're on.
No
All right,
motion,
great.
it's just a request.
We've this was a formal agendized vote about how we were going to do this, so we'd have to agendize that item. I'd be happy to agendize that and have that as a conversation. I'm not ready to make that decision at this point in time. Thank you.
So I need two
All
more
righty.
votes?
Didn't realize that.
You need what?
2 more votes.
Two more votes on
yeah.
on item 2, which is direct staff to come back with items 7, 8, and 9, please. All righty.
Thank you to everyone for all your time and effort.
And for you
And
too.
all this.